Hello everyone, let's see what's going on. And let's make sure that's going up to that. And I will apologize now in advance. Hello everyone. We have been told we have broadband issues, and by that I mean issues with the actual fiber optic broadband, which I'm told are very rare, but we have managed to contract them. It's an amazing skill our family has. So if I do disappear or anything, it's because the broadband has died. And I will be reforging fibers and optics. Let's see who we got here. Hello, John Shea. Okay, Bijon is putting songs into the chat. Hello, Bijon. Hello, Calvin Gasberg. Hello, Peter Dawson. Hello, Jess P. Hello, Grace Sowski. Jess P. Hello. Hello, Paul from Chicago. Oh, he's turning it into a Blackburn song. Hello, everyone. Hello, Albozaski. Hello, Teamy Looker. Hello, DG40. Hello. Full stock of the brew. I have, well, let's put it this way. This day has been, so far this, but don't worry, there is this. And I'm hoping you can all hear me. Hello, Seneca Nero, and I'm not sure about that being a meditation phrase. Dupi de l'homme is not a meditation phrase in any way, shape, or form. So, let's start off with a couple of things. Today, of course, we're doing the Defence White Paper of Defence 1966, which becomes a defence policy. And it's as silly as I can possibly think of any paper being. Because, and this is the problem, there are people who look at the 1966 white paper and they find some of the contents in lines now and go, this is some brilliant strategic insight and thinking, and you go, yes, that line is amazing. But the trouble is, the more and more you read the stuff about what the government's saying about the Defence White Paper and the way the government's considering the Defence White Paper, the more you realise that what it is about money. It's all about money. And I will clear up something. Bill Bolton, back in the 60s, a billion was a million million. In British English, now we use it to mean 1,000 million, like the USA. It wasn't being allergic to the word billion. The first and presumably last time I have defended Dennis Healy. Well, Bill Bolton, that's true. But I still found it slightly annoying. And I have to admit, there were other people. That was the sort of time there was a bit of a transition going on. And I feel that he was, in many ways, because we are investing 2 billion, or we're investing 2,000 million. It sounds bigger. It's the same number as it is said now, but it sounds bigger. There were some really interesting questions. Anyway, as it's the start and as this has come up, I'm going to point this out. So, if this is the first time you've ever watched one of these videos, this is going to become a shock to you. To one of you who've watched these videos a lot, you're going to be seeing this a lot. Because, as many of you who watch this video regularly, these videos regularly will know, my aunt has set a challenge. My family, the way we show our love is we set friendly challenges. Or not so friendly challenges, depending on your perspective. And this particular challenge is quite simple. If I get to 13,000 subscribers by December the 31st, 2021, that's this year, my aunt and uncle will take pictures of themselves wearing Blackburn, Blackburn. Face masks. So, as I'm now just about over 6,500, hopefully, I've got 6,498 of you to try and accrue by December the 31st. Which, broadly speaking, and this I'm saying as it's September's sort of beginning still, it's September, October, November, December. Let's go and say roughly 120 days for 6,000, roughly 6,500 subscribers. By my count, that means I need to be making roughly 35 new subscribers every day to reach there in a linear fashion. So I need your help. Please, if you like the video, subscribe, but please also share. Please say it to your friends, and please tell them why. Tell them it's for familial bragging rights, and it'd be doing a naval historian a favour. Thank you. And thank you to... I'm going to say this because I'm going to remember this, because a gentleman has been going around telling people a lot about coming on here, and I wanted to make a mention of them. No, not that one. Toby Jug. Thank you to Toby Jug. Keep sending people here. Thank you, Toby Jug. It's very kind of them, and thank you. Right then, let's get to the questions as we're going through, because this is, after all, a live. Right. Hello, John Shea. Hello, Zachary Gherkin. Hello, Hieroglyph. I only got halfway through the white paper I uploaded earlier. The strategic situation in 2020 faces similar questions and constraints to that of the 1960s, but only similar. I wouldn't say things are as bad as sometimes they're made out. They sound worse than they necessarily are. Aegis Flow, hello. And I was asking, actually, what's the 1996 white paper for non-islanders? The 1966 white paper, let's start off with that, is how governments work is they produce a white paper on their policies and on their laws. And then that is voted into law. An Act of Parliament goes through various stages, as does budgeting and as does proposal, defence policy, etc. And normally when it's finally produced, it becomes a white paper. And it's, as the name suggests, it's printed on white paper, which means it's the final version. Evening, Paul Beswick. Albazaski, Hieroglyph, no. We're going to get into this, and I do keep trying to make the same point. Britain were under financial obligations, but calling them massive... There is a narrative which goes on around the 1966 Defence White Paper, and there is a reality. As Dan Freeman said, generally the green papers, and generally a green paper comes in and then it's a white paper. There can also be something called a pink paper. That usually only comes around in the fence, and there's a pink paper, then a green paper, then a white paper. Sometimes pink paper is also used for other things in the fence. It's quite fun. The pink paper turns up. I don't know why the Ministry of Defence is so attracted to pink paper, but they are. John, look, everyone start to dig out your burner, troll, and spare accounts. I'm not necessarily encouraging that, because that would be a very bad way, dishonourable way to win, but if I don't know. Tasha Suvashal, what about IL-20 postal masks? Wait a bit. I might start doing that. Hello, turning 3434. And I missed the old WHS 4-colour A4 pads, pink, green, blue, and yellow. Yep. And of course, Type 82s were also cancelled. But let's start off with This is government spending as a percentage of British GDP. Now, I am starting off with this because one of the things that comes up and people often bring to me is defense spending is out of control in the 1960s. It doesn't look it. Government spending could be argued to be out of control in the 1960s, especially when you consider it's getting 47% and will in the 1970s get to 50% of GDP. And any time government spending goes higher than 40%, you usually say governments are having trouble. There's got to be a good reason, i.e., you have to be a world war or in a national pandemic, or there's a massive financial problem going on. This, of course, comes from ukpublicspending.co.uk. They are fairly decent stat source material. And this is the basic background. When we start talking about a geostrategic situation, when we start talking about the problems that Britain was facing, you have to consider what's the government spending its money on. And in this case, these are the percentages of GDP. That's percentage. Now, these days, there is a debate as to whether we're 1.8 or 2.3% of GDP. This goes right up to current day. So you can compare it to current day defence spending and what current day defence spending buys. But you can also think that, well, a little bit ago, we had 4% of defence of GDP was not spent on defence. And you can imagine what the British Armed Forces could be like if they had that. Because the theory is, and this is one of the limitations when you do spend less money on defence, you probably need the same level of infrastructure, especially for high-tech equipment. Defence spending actually tends to get more efficient up to a certain level in peacetime, and you get more bang for your buck up to a certain level because you have to build that base level of infrastructure to support that high-tech equipment anyway. So, one of the interesting questions which came up, and this came up earlier, was about, and I've got the questions up from the earlier video, the video which is there's a link down below, the recorded video. And it's from Old Richard. What are your thoughts on Trident? Is it a wise investment for UK in light of the US nuclear deterrent umbrella? How many useful destroyers and frigates could be had instead? Well, the first question I always ask is, do you think the British government would spend the money on more destroyers and frigates instead? Or would they be like the governments in this point, where they promised that they were going to spend the money on bombers instead of carriers, and then neither the bombers nor the carriers get procured? I don't trust that. But I would also say, do you trust the US nuclear umbrella to always act in British interests? If you trust that, then that's fine. But the problem is, if you don't, or if you think, well, hang on, and this is the thing I have with people, I go, yeah, what happens if you get another President Trump? He's America first, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't have a disagreement with a president standing out there and saying America first. He's elected by the US. He is their president. They are supposed to come first in his priorities. I can understand that. But the thing is, the moment you're saying that, that means that's not NATO first. That's not Britain first. That's not our allies first. That's not the world first. That's America first. Which means that if a nuclear power, is threatening Britain, and it's, let's say, over something which America doesn't wish to get involved in, then America might well back down and might go, well, it's not our problem. And the thing is, that can come to British allies as well, because our nuclear umbrella doesn't only protect us, it also, to an extent, covers our Commonwealth and our NATO partners as well. So the thing is, our nuclear umbrella is a USP, something which few other nations have. And it's also part of our ticket to being on the United Nations Security Council. Saying that, if I'm going to have a system and I'm Britain, the only system I'm going to have is a continuous at-sea deterrent. And there is a reason for that. Anytime someone says to you, you could cut the number of boats and only deploy it when you need it. Here's the answer to that question. So you're dealing with a high-risk situation. There's a lot of stress going on. When do you deploy the SSBN? Because the moment you deploy your ballistic missile submarine, you are ramping up the tensions. If it's deployed, it's a ceiling on the tensions. It's a case of, you do anything, it gets bad, so don't do it. But if you're deploying it, when tensions arise, that's just going to cause the tensions to skyrocket, if not blow up completely. Or you're not going to deploy it because you don't want the tensions to skyrocket, in which case it'll be taken out. So you either do continuous at sea deterrent, and do it properly, or you don't do it at all. I don't mind. I can honestly make the case either way. You have to accept the limitations that come on your policy if you don't have it. They're limitations. They happen. If that's what you want, that's fine. But if you're going to do it the best and safest way possible, which is continuous at sea deterrent. In which case, your option is Trident. I'm sorry, it is. If you're Western, it's Trident. It's the most sensible system to go with, and you might as well be as involved in it as we are. But that's the policy. That's the limiting factor. And anytime someone suggests, oh, we should sign up with the French, I go, well, the trouble is the French are even more mercurial in their foreign policy than the Americans are. And the Americans are interesting enough. Every country's interesting when it comes to their interests and their foreign policy, but yeah. It's just, there's a limit. In car, does the defense spending chart include Polaris Trident? Yes. It does on these people. Alzaski, oh my god, white, green, pink rainbows are coming soon. Hopefully not. I don't think so, because, and there's a reason for that. They have their colours the whole way through. If you're adding in another layer of colouring, that means you're adding in another layer of bureaucracy. I know you're probably meaning it as a joke, but honestly, there have been talks over the years for blue, for all sorts of colours to be added in as another layer of discussion, and frankly, it just scares the bejesus out of me. It just will make everything take that much longer, because every paper has to go through a massive consultation process, and then it evolves into the next paper, and then it goes back to the beginning and goes through it again. It's just... Then pink papers are also used when detaining someone on the Mental Health Act. Yes. Basically, pink means something special. John Luke, there is nothing more honourable than victory. Klingon proverb. Useful. Vision, didn't the UK and other NATO members commit to spending... they committed to spending 2% of GDP on defence. 2%, not 0.0002, but 2%. Sometimes feel like that. Agrisansky, how much of that was manpower cost? Numerically, the military's been shrinking for decades. That would be a whole other level added onto this, but that was quite significant in the 1960s. It wasn't as significant as you might think, because generally people were paid terribly at that point in the armed forces. Dan, currently it does include strategic nuclear weapons, as Dan said, and it was also starting to roll in pensions and some foreign aid to add up to the magic NATO's 2%. Bad guy 8869, a lot easier to take something out when it's tied up dockside than when it's underway. Very true. Team Locker, you need at least 4 to 8 SSBNs deployed in any time to cover the UK and its Commonwealth. We usually have 4 to guarantee 1 at sea. Because the thing is, they pretty much can hit anywhere in the world, and you only need to wipe out a place once. And frankly, we prefer not to. Everyone would prefer not to. There was a huge debate at various points about how the mix of warheads and MIRVs they should carry, and it's always ongoing. to make sure they're a viable deterrent and everyone knows it. Dan Freeman, have there been any Anglo-French defence projects that have worked apart from Jaguar since the Entente Cordiale of 1905? We are hoping that the new heavy attack missile is going to work. We're hoping. I'm also keep banging on at people to buy the Norwegian strike missile, but you know. Turning 343. The worst thing lately was our foreign affairs minister saying, "We're angry at France and UK because they were preparing for Afghan and not telling us." M. Howard. European NATO members were worried about the USA trying to contain a nuclear exchange to Europe in the 80s. Yeah. Peter Dawson is quite correct. Lynx and Puma helicopters. It's pretty much nuclear deterrent, and as I say this, 4 SSBNs, guarantees 1 at sea, that's your tripwire. That's a case of the amount of damage that will cause to you. Yes, you'll probably wreck the UK, but they'll wreck you, so there's no point. That's the aim. That's the whole point of mutually assured destruction. Right. So, here is a sort of interesting set of documents. When I put them together, I was quite interested because they are 4 of the biggest spending areas of government: defence, health, education, welfare. And really, the point I think should be made is that the 1960s aren't about government really cutting spending. They're about government changing the focus of spending. I would argue that Dennis Healey wasn't talking about a rampaging away defence budget, because it honestly wasn't. It was in decline before he got there. I'm sorry, he gets into post in 1964. I'll expand this to full, but as you can see, it's been going down since pretty much 1962, 63, if not earlier. It had a slight bump, but that was a very slight bump and can be accounted for in various reasons, with various programs being introduced. And the fact is, it goes down, 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 then it stays fairly constant, and then bump up for the Falklands War, and a little bump up for some of the issues in Northern Ireland, and then it goes down again in the 1980s, and then it goes down into the 1990s, and then there's the peace dividend, woohoo! And then that crashes down lower. Yep. Is it Meteor mainly Anglo-French? You could argue it. Concorde? There was a whole debate on that one over how to spell Concorde. 23434. Looking at the healthcare doubling every 5 years. Population aging is a real thing. Yeah, healthcare is having to go up, but also there's a lot more being included in the NHS at this point. You're looking at the NHS spending going up. It's not just to do with aging population, it's also to do with the range of treatments they're offering. It's to do with the cost of medicines, the cost of the treatments, and the fact that life expectancy is going up and people expect a better quality of life, so they expect to be taken care of, which is fine. That's what you have a National Health Service for. John Luke, what is the likelihood that spending will have to increase? Decline mirrors relative international stability. That is waning now, and the US could be said to be less reliable than the US first strategy. Well, that becomes a problem. And the big issue becomes, and it's able to be seen here. Where do you get the money from? If we go back to this chart, well, thanks to COVID and various other things, UK the government spending as part of GDP already nearly hit 55%. They don't want to keep it up there. That's dangerous levels. That's very uneconomic levels. So they'll want it to drop down. So they'll want to cut government spending. Now, the cuts of some of the programs that they've introduced for COVID, that's one thing. That's going to cut spending quite dramatically. They'll probably also want to an extent, spend their way out. But increasing defence spending, well, let's say Britain decides to take it up to 3%. That could be very sensible. But where are they going to get the money from? Are they going to take it from welfare, education, healthcare? Nicest way that you even take off the entire foreign aid budget, which I wouldn't support because actually getting rid of foreign aid is counterintuitive. Being smarter about how foreign aid is spent, that could be certainly viable. There have been some interesting projects over the years. There have been many, many good projects. The thing is, the good projects outweigh the interesting projects. But the interesting projects, unfortunately, make headlines. However, that's only a 0.7%, and when it's at its full amount. 1% would be a viable increase for Britain. And the armed forces could probably function on it and manage to deal with it. But also, before anyone's going to start giving them money, a financial increase, you're going to have to get the army to the level that the RAF and the Navy are in terms of being reliable funders as far as the government's concerned. Yes, they still have they still have things which go wrong. Projects which go wrong. That's not a problem. When you're spending that much money on high-tech equipment, things will go wrong. It happens. What they are worried about is things blowing up completely. And let's be honest, the Ajax program is looking more and more like it is going to blow up completely. It is looking like it's going to. Oh, Richard, how is the decline of US influence affecting MOD strategic thinking? By the way, I absolutely love my new Blackburn coffee mug. Well, I'm glad you enjoy your Blackburn coffee mug. I have to admit, I am putting off getting stuff a bit before I get back from my next research trip. In that, the idea is I will have some more stuff so I can have it behind me so people can see what it looks like, so they can know what they're buying. But I'm very glad if you got it and you're enjoying it. As to the thing, how is the decline of US influence affecting MOD strategic thinking? I don't. You see, the thing is, the point that was made to me the other day when I was discussing this, and I was listening to the debate quite well, was that the US is still the most powerful dog around in the global park. They are still the big one. They have the biggest and most powerful set of jaws. The trouble is, the person holding the end of the leash is seemingly, as it often happens with presidents in their first term. Presidents in their first term tend to be very much domestic policy focused. And this is always sort of balanced it out, because usually they do their first term in domestic policy, and their second term they elected in domestic and re-elected in foreign. The trouble is, you've now had Obama, who was pretty orientated on domestic policies the whole way through. He talked a good game on foreign policy, but didn't really do much on it. You've then had Trump, who was interesting in that he has One of the things about Trump is he actually did sometimes come up with the right idea. It was just the execution of it was absolutely silly. And sometimes he came out with the completely, where did that idea come from? And you're sort of going, I think possibly you're not getting the right information. I think possibly Trump was a victim of his own staff choices. But we'll leave that to one side. And now we've got Biden, who is, again, a domestic policy hawk. That is what Biden loves. Biden is incredibly focused on America's internal issues. And I would argue that's almost like Britain in the 1960s here. Dennis Healey is not a peacenik. At no point was I calling him a peacenik. I have to admit, someone did suggest I said that. And yes, he did fight in Italy. He had fought. But I also think he's being disingenuous when he's talking about the defense budget running away with itself. Because it's not. What he is, though, is and especially when he becomes Chancellor and his party, are very much focused on fixing Britain, on focusing inwards. The politicians are looking inwards, not the country. Britain as a country can never afford to look inwards. It's one of the things I find strange about the whole Brexit debate and all sorts of other things when they talk about people. Britain can never afford to look inwards. Britain has always had to look outwards because we've always had to be a trading economic nation. That's always had to be our viability. Because that's what we've got. We have to trade. And we've had to trade for a long, long time. We're talking centuries. We've had to be like this. It's now become ingrained in the national mindset. And it's, to an extent, the American mindset is different because America, remember, it's colossal. You can go to America and you can literally plot European countries and they will take up only sections of states. It is colossal. America is a continent, arguably. I know there's Canada above it and Mexico below it, but the sodding great big middle part of it is America. And this means that they can very easily get cornered out in domestic affairs. And this is what happens. And honestly, I'd say the U.S. Navy has been having a wonderful ride because they've had very nearly 80 years of continuous love compared to what they were traditionally received. Usually, it was about they got 5 years of love followed by 10 years of neglect. No, they're due for some neglecting because, as a rule, the American Congress is always happy to cut. Always happy to cut because they're always focused on the domestic thing because the domestic is this huge area. Thank you, Peter, for reminding Melanie. And Melanie, I hope you're enjoying Bill Trumps. Turning 343. Don't just hand out budget. We don't need 40 not OPVs. No. But you could start. You see, if I was the thing I would do if the British budget did go up to 3%, you could make some very sensible cases for very sensible things. Like, honestly, if we go for using Boxer, we create 3 Striker Star brigades. And we create we add some, I don't know, Boxer if it can be made amphibious enough for the Royal Marines, or maybe we buy some US Marine Corps APCs. I don't know. Probably, I would lean towards the latter, but we're now buying Boxers, so it might be sensible to buy Boxers for the Marines as well. And have the Marines both provide those very forward presence forces, which they're talking about, and have a rapid reaction brigade based around the amphibious forces, and have a parachute brigade, and have the strike for air supply when we can do it, like with Afghanistan, and have a rapid mobility division, a strike division, and have an armoured brigade or so that can be formed up behind it. That would seem sensible to me as a deployment force for Britain at the moment. But that's me getting into army affairs. Naval affairs, give us some LHDs. We need about 3 of them. Yes, but if you're not going to put your old people on icebergs and send them out to sea, healthcare is going to cost a lot. Unless percentage of old people in the population comes into better balance. 1964. Did you say Blackburn coffee cup? Yes. Old Richard has one. Kenrick Johnson, do you think turning Diego Garcia and Ascension into overseas garrison bases would be an idea? I recently saw that Montserrat's proposed site of a base. I think probably the Falkland Islands could do with being upgraded, and having, if we're going to forward base forces for South America and the South Atlantic, the Falkland Islands would seem to be the obvious place to start, because it's already got a significant Mount Pleasant, already got significant defence infrastructure there. It seems like the cheapest place to start upgrading, because the base infrastructure is already there, so you can upgrade from that a bit quite easily. Diego Garcia, well, that would be joint basing of the Americans, maybe. But at the moment we're using Bahrain and Singapore, which are probably easier to support. So, what was the huge increase in budget in the 1980s? That little bump you see is the lovely Falklands War, followed by the huge bump in welfare spending in the 1980s, when lots and lots of people are unemployed and in job transition. In car, this time UK GDP is affected by continuously reducing North Sea oil revenues. Yeah. But that mainly comes in the 70s. And then there's the gas. Turning 3434, Jeffy, I think the most worrying part aren't costs, but the fact that the ratio of retirees and working population is becoming like 1/4 of what it was 20 years ago. Aegis Flow, very tactful assessments of the former and current presidents. John Paul Chicago, America is a superpower, not a sea power. Yeah. I'll get into this in a second. I'll just catch up the chat. John Luke, US influence hasn't declined, but it has received a black eye. Adversaries would be perhaps wise, but depending on heading in another direction. They still don't have the biggest sticks. Turning 3434, I'm trying to avoid mentioning that. Better Paul this week. Did NASA replace the USN in Congress eyes with regards to cutting funding? Potentially. But now they seem to be back in love with NASA, probably because Boeing and all sorts of other companies are starting to put funding into lobbyists on the subject. And of course, Russia and China have signed up to build a moon base. And suddenly America is going, they are not getting there first. Space Race 2.0 is back. And then there'll be the race to Mars. You're never going to war with a peer opponent without Australia, Canada, or the US. UK needs more and more sea lift. That will help military more than anything. Dr. Clarke, you didn't actually read what I wrote there. No, I auto-corrected it. Hello, Andrew Campbell. Vision. Foreign policy is an issue cared about most heavily by the few and not the most in the US. And honestly, no one I know in my daily life cared a whit about Afghanistan. That doesn't surprise me. Andrew Campbell, will be finished while I finish my delivery runs, while I have signal. Thank you. Hi, Student Navigator. Hieroglyph. Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal was so incompetent that I predicted a one-term president, suspect of personality. Yeah, the trouble. Who knows? I'm not so sure about the senality question. I think it's kind of like George Bush and his accent. It covers a lot of sins if he goes for it. But that's me. I'm cynical when it comes to it. It's this day. Leaving Afghanistan showed NATO the EGDU needs to spend on their defence. Well, they need to certainly spend on logistics because they can't do Afghanistan without logistics. But here again, if someone had built a sodding railway to Afghanistan, we wouldn't be having this problem. Sorry. Peter Dawson, Mars, don't snicker. So, here is the speech. With permission, I will make a statement about the Defence Review. And this is from Dennis Healey, who was then the Secretary of State for Defence. He's the longest serving Secretary of State for Defence we've ever had in the United Kingdom, doing 6 years. He becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer after this. The House will recall that on taking office 16 months ago, Her Majesty's government set themselves to halt the runaway growth in Britain's defence expenditure by planning to limit the size of the defence budget in 1969 to 70 to that of the 1964 to 65 or 2,000 million at constant prices. Let's see. Runaway growth in Britain's defence expenditure. It's barely even mentioning on that one, but obviously you need to zoom in. Here you go. Runaway growth in Britain's defence expenditure. So he's saying, he came into power saying, I would expect there to be a runaway growth in Britain's defence expenditure. Can anyone see a runaway growth going on? No. No, that doesn't look like a runaway growth to me. That looks like, broadly speaking, just a tad above inflation. But that's, of course, compared to total government spending, which is rising significantly more. But this is just me. I just checked the facts. As we stated in but it is very financially focused, this one. Very financially focused. As we stated in last year's Defence White Paper, we assumed responsibility for forces which were seriously overstretched and in certain respects dangerously under-equipped. Where have I heard this before? It seems to be every government claims the same. It has been an equally important objective of the Defence Review to bring our commitments into balance for the manpower and equipment we could afford to have. We have already done better than the financial target of 2,000 million in the estimates for 1966 to 67, since they represent only 1,972 million at 1964 prices. Again, it's focusing in on the costs a lot here. Part 1 of the white paper indicates how we plan not only to stay within the same financial ceiling in 3 years' time. Let's see, do they do that? If that doesn't look like they actually manage it, because let's be honest, that's looking far closer to the 3,000 million line than the actual 2,000 million line. But that's just me again. But also to undertake a major program of re-equipment and to reduce the overstretch from which our forces still suffer. In order to ensure the achievement of these objectives, we have had to make a new assessment of the part in which our armed forces should play in supporting our foreign policy in the 1970s, and of what role Britain should play in the world affairs. It has been essentially an exercise in political and military realism. It's been an exercise in cost cutting. Come on, you just said already you're operating a budget ceiling. Everything has been about budget, not secure. And now you're finally bringing in the foreign policy. The results may be summarised as follows. Broadly speaking, in cutting the previous government's planned expenditure by 16%, or 400 million. In terms of government spending in the 1960s, 400 million is not quite a rounding error, but not exactly extortion. But also, it doesn't seem to be cut by 400 million, because I'm looking at this and, well, 400 million, you would expect a far bigger drop down than it actually is, but okay. Again, We have achieved 3/4 of our savings by getting better value for money, and only 1/4 by reductions in our military capability. You tried getting better value for money from the British Aerospace? As a rule, they tell you the price and that's it. In order to reduce overstretch, we plan to cut our task overseas. It's always a nice idea. And then to keep a large proportion of our forces in a home station and fewer abroad, and to rely more on reinforcement by air in emergency. Reinforcement by air. Well, it's only the age that the SAM's coming in and everyone's developing the Stinger and the Shoulder, the SA-7 and all those things that will come into service. So, yeah, let's keep relying on air, because what we really want is large transport aircraft going in where a manpower can take them out. This has meant certain changes in our current political commitments overseas. Okay. That's half the opening remarks. The other half of the opening remarks will come after the next slides. But let's think about this. Britain's cutting commitments. The point is, though, let's say he's right. Let's say he is being honest and he is planning on cutting commitments. You would then expect them, if they were being honest and the reasons were this new strategy, when they find they can't cut commitments, they have to go and find the money from elsewhere. They have to go find the money to fund it. Either that, or you have to admit that what you're doing is you're cutting for the sake of saving money, and you have no idea, you're not taking any notice of the strategy at all. I'm tired of being a virus expert. This week, I will be an Afghanistan expert. Don't get me started on that. Do you know it? I really hope the UK becomes less dependent on allies. Fingers crossed we spend 3%. That would be sort of what Britain would need to start having a slightly more organic defensive policy. But honestly, for that 3%, the biggest thing you'd be probably looking at buying is strengthening the fleet auxiliary, maybe a few more escorts and a few more things, but you'd be looking at logistics assets as well as strengthening numbers of some of the numbers of things to grow up, because we have all the stuff we pay. This is what you have to remember for Britain, and this is the true of a lot of medium powers. We pay for all the infrastructure. We set it all up to support it. It's like we've bought all the stuff necessary to support a far larger air group of F-35s than we actually are buying, because we based all around the idea of the maximum number we might need to buy, which is 138. To 144. And now we're trying to buy as few as possible. Portugal. Biden pulled out of Afghanistan now because by the time the midterms roll around, they won't care anymore. More than likely. Hi, King George V. Hi, Potter ending game. Graham Hanna, maybe you might want to explain how the Labour Party was composed at the time and their thinking. The Labour Party is an interesting organisation, but in the 1960s, they're probably at their peak in terms of they have a large mixture of people who are veterans, but mostly coming from the union movement. They are a large source of them, so they are domestically focused. Yes, there are always rumours of flirtings with communism and all sorts of things for their various members, but not really. And in the nicest way, there is a large gap between socialism and communism when you look at what actual socialism is and what communism is. And there is an even larger gap between the British Union movement and communism, despite the jokes you occasionally get on various programs. See, when we do say billion now, you have to. The Labour Party are not bad people. Dennis Healey, as said earlier, served in Italy. He had fought. He's not a peacenik, but he is domestically policy focused. And okay, this is where I get into trouble because normally when I teach this, I have charts, but I'm going to try and explain as I can. And if I wonder if my board markers would work on those. Probably not. So, if you have a political spectrum and you say this is the centre, and you then put on what to me is left and to me is right, okay? But I think this is your. Because looking at me and I'm checking. This is, but the thing is, yeah, left, right. Left side, right side for me. I think that's the opposite way around for you. Anyway. Now, if you go through the spectrum and you put American politics on it, American politics tends to be skewed to the right. Okay? Tends to be skewed over here. European politics tends to be skewed slightly to the left in comparison. Their real centre is slightly over here, American centre is slightly over here, and the British centre is broadly in the middle. This means that, broadly speaking, the Democrat Party lines up with pretty much the centre of the Conservative Party at their rightist wing, and then go at their centre, at the centre point of US policy, and then go and sort of goes towards Labour Party. The Republican Party starts probably with the Conservatives and then goes to the right of them, to the right. Conservatives, middle, Labour Party. So Labour Party will sound to American ears sometimes. You'd sit there and go, oh, they must be commie. They're not commie. They're socialist. If you want communists, you go to the Green Party. Oh, sorry. Not quite. The Green Party are they are sometimes very interesting, but they're not even communist. They are green up and they have some very interesting ideas. I'm never quite sure how practical they are. They always have good ideas. I always ask them to explain how they plan on paying for them. And it usually comes down to the idea that they will put more tax in it and on the rich. And I sit there and go, but the people you want to tax are also the people who can most easily move abroad and avoid paying that tax. Well, it's the trouble. Inevitably, and this is the reality of history, if governments decide to raise more money, it will have to come from the middle classes. Because if they're not taxing if they just focus on the most wealthy people, they will move. Or rather, some of them won't, but enough of them will that you won't get enough money in. But the middle classes both have and are wedded enough to the system that they aren't likely to move, but are actually earn enough that they can pay the extra tax.
So that's why the taxes tend to fall on the middle classes. And unfortunately, tax cuts these days tend to be focused on they tend to sort of depend where they're going to focus the tax cuts. But that's broadly speaking, and normally I do this with a whiteboard and I'm talking to students and I explain it through and I give them actual examples and I take them through the policies. Because if you consider in the UK, the British Conservative Party supports the National Health Service. So when someone turns around and goes, oh, the Conservatives in the UK are the equivalent of the Republicans in the United States, I go, how many Republicans would support a nationalised health service? How many Republican-run local governments support increasing council housing? The Conservatives are, in a nice way, compared to the Republicans, the British Conservative Party is probably sounding quite left-wing. But they are the right wing in the UK. So, the Labour Party in the 1960s, they are not communist. They are socialist, but I would say more union working movement socialist than socialist theocracy academic socialist. Okay? Portugal, reinforcement by air worked very well in the Falklands. It doesn't work then or now. Sea lift, sea lift, sea lift. Well, reinforcement by air worked fine to Ascension, which was a benign environment. This is the point. If you've got a benign environment, an environment you control, reinforcement by air is perfectly sensible and perfectly practical. The trouble is it's reinforcement by air in a contested zone. That's where you got the issues. Monday 6 Dr. Clarke, why should we go through the expense of building railways? Anything needed can simply be driven onto an aircraft and flown in. It'll get there so much faster than all rail transport too. The thing is, Melanie, if you build a railway into Afghanistan and you built the railways for Afghanistan, you would set up you would integrate them into the wider local economy, but you would also stabilize the civilian market as well as the military market and make it incredibly cheaper for everyone else to operate. Because the thing is, flying stuff in and out is expensive. Trains can move a lot of goods relatively easily, relatively cost effectively, especially in that sort of area. Also, it would have given people a practical, visible benefit of all the hydroelectric dams which they were building. Ian Carl, many defence contracts in the 1960s were cost plus rather than fixed price contracts, which led to inefficiencies and cost budget overruns. Yes! 1960 and 40. Hell, you can even drive a Challenger 2 in the plane, strap it down and fly them. You can do that. It's very expensive per ton, as Pete Dawson said. See much. SI, you have to, Yes, we do have the term quadrillion also going around. John Luke, why don't we secure all equipment in low orbit? Oh. That would be correct from. Carl Gasma, there is communism, socialism, and the crop style socially aware capitalist. Oh, there are even weirdness things beyond that. Hi, Potter Ending Game. I just popped in while waiting for my curry to be delivered. This is all very interesting. Thank you. USA Air Force has a grand total of 52 aircraft that can fly a Challenger 2. I'm sure they aren't in high demand or anything. Heck, the Ukraine even has private cargo aircraft that can fly a Challenger 2. How many does the British Air Force have that can fly a Challenger 2? They're pretty much C-17s. And yes, they can fly a Challenger 2, but they're also in demand for other things. And that's the problem with airlift as well. You can turn up and you might be able to carry one Challenger 2, or maybe two if you're very lucky, depending on the aircraft and its abilities to do it. And it's getting the US Air Force, because maybe the US Air Force the US government doesn't want you to deploy Charlie 2s. Because let's be honest, and this will sound terrible, But if the British had deployed a couple of Challenger 2s to Kabul airport to help secure the area along with the Paras, they could have probably rolled back quite a large chunk of any forces around the gates and made it secure. But no one wanted to deploy tanks there because that would have looked aggressive and would have looked bad. Even though it would have been very sensible from a force protection perspective. And of course, remember, you don't just have to fly in the vehicle. You have to fly in its spare parts, its maintenance, its shells, everything. Juno, hey, Dr. Clarke, I think most of us are reasonable and won't chimp out on you talking about something as hard to discuss about as politics. Thank you. Now, Trim, I would say the tax cuts tend to fall where the swing votes are seen as being. Yep, that can happen. Go to face, that ambulance is not going to pay for itself, no. Vision, Doctor, given what you say, Biden and Johnson should get along well. If they can manage Irish issues well enough, both are big on railways and climate change, while using the slogan, Build Back Better. Well, that slogan might have been rather helpful because they shared an election team. This is the thing. Again, this is the fun thing. I it's sort of the British. When the British have elections, you get in all these election specialists come across brought in from all around the world to help with the various campaigns. And then once they won an election in the UK, they might go on to another election in America, and then to Australia, and then back to Britain, and they will hop. The consultants hop between political parties, and sometimes they'll be Democrats, sometimes they'll be Conservatives in the UK, Democrats in America. Just sit there and go, yeah, you're just in it for the money, and you're good at it. Also, I'm trying to wind Dr. Clarke up. Flying in tanks and such is incredibly impractical, and the aircraft capable of doing such things are very precious strategic assets. Dr. Clarke, can a C-15 lift the Challenger 2? I was figuring on C-5s. I'm sure I've seen one in a C-17, but I think it was literally one at a time. John Wood, also, it's not just transporting tanks, it's transporting ammunition, people, spare parts, and yeah, fuel needed for operate. This is why building a railway. We were in Afghanistan for 20-sodding years. We didn't think to build them in a railway. It would have made so much sense. Also, you could have linked them up with all the other countries around there by a nice railway, made it go rundling around with all the trade, and stabilised the economy. Suddenly, they would have had a good way to move goods in and out, which would have been cheap and effective, which would help the economy grow, and would help them change their expenses, and it would have given them something tangible, visible, that people could see as something improvement. Tony 343. To be honest, Challenger 2s and the other 42 planes are all the equipment you need to remotely able to operate for longer than a day. John Luke, how many Ajaxes will you fit in a plane? How many will work? Dirkland 95. I'm imagining how that would go. Taliban charge the gates. Charlie 2 lasts in 120mm Hesh. We'd hope it wouldn't be that bad. But you see, the thing is, that is, if you're doing force protection, the best thing you can have for force protection is a actual main battle tank sitting there. We've known this since Bosnia. In the nicest way, the snow leopards, I think they were the Danish snow leopards, were vital. Any time Michael Rose, the general out there, Lieutenant General Michael Rose, had a problem, he would get the snow leopards deployed. And their tanks would turn up, and they'd roll in. And they fought actual tank battles with Serbians, Czechoslovakians, all sorts of different sides in Bosnia. They were really, really useful. And they were painted white because they were on a UN mission. So they were Leopard main battle tanks painted white. because they were UN. But they did really well. They were really useful for force protection for doing that. So actually, there is a good solid case that you should have tanks as part of your force protection when you're deploying to these areas. The Canadians had tanks, I think, in Afghanistan, and they were useful. Too much. Blair and Clinton were the first to share campaign people and strategies, I think. Oh, yeah. Vision. Build Back Better is a saying originated with UN rebuilding projects for tsunamis and other mega disasters over the past 3 decades. Oh, it's been around for a long time. I'm fairly sure there was a Build Back Better said during World War II, probably about the Blitz. And probably the Germans said the same thing about British bombing on their cities. I think you could have done, Paul, but that's off topic for this one. We're on the 1966 white paper. Garhaman. The Danes had tanks in Bosnia. They did, as I said, the snow leopards. Garhaman. Same story told by a chieftain in Iraq. People started causing issues. The gun points at them, and now are you going to behave? Good, I thought so. Yeah, that's the other thing. It's going to sound strange, but the gun of a main battle tank is kind of like the main gun on a warship. It's not possibly the most lethal weapon in a commander's arsenal, but it can swivel round and point at the target, and without needing to fire or do anything, it makes the point. And that's part of the problems with this defense spending, okay? This is defense spending, 1950 to 2000. At no point has it crossed the 50 billion mark. That's the thing. So that's fine. Government spending, is now 350 billion, or 350,000 million. Defense spending has just about crossed the 30 billion mark. So it's a tenth if you look at this sort of figure down here. And this is the 1960s, and this is the point I've been trying to make. Even with their cuts, defense spending has to go up, but it doesn't go up as much as government spending has to go up. And there are reasons for this. Yes, there's inflation and other issues. But the point is, you are cutting 400 million from defense in 1964 to save money. By 1964, you are, we can call it 12,500 million. And by 1970, you're spending 21,500 million a year, which means your budget increase will be 9,000 million in terms of spending. So you've cut 400 million, and you're going to increase spending by 22.5 times it in total. Hi, Rick Vasava. Juno, Steam 17 has a carrying capacity of 78 tons, so it should be capable. Personally, I would carry in some IFV. Also, you just use it as a well-armored machine gun nest with thermals. Jack Ray. In the 1800s, did the British apply pressure on small nations to keep them in line as better strategy than occupying them? Yeah. That was pretty much half the time reason we bombarded places. No, the British were using a system right up until the 1920s and 30s, which would basically be you'd have a visit from a sloop. Then you'd have a visit from a cruiser, or whatever equivalent on the station. Then you'd have a visit from maybe a couple of cruisers, or maybe a larger asset would turn up. And then maybe a couple more things would turn up. And if you weren't listening, then they might well bombard something. And go, or at least threaten to bombard something. And then they might actually bombard it. The whole point was to try and get the locals to deal with it to your satisfaction. It wasn't nice, it was bullying, let's be honest. It was gunboat diplomacy, but it was bullying. But they tried to cloak it as was tried to be a mailed fist in a velvet glove for as long as possible. For as long as possible. Until the velvet glove came off and the mailed fist crashed down. And it, as I said, it's gunboat diplomacy. These days, would you want to do that? Well, these days, probably what you do is you launch a couple of tomahawks at something and just go, But to be honest, we do that anyway. We just do it the expensive way. And it's often without the first visits. It's often a strongly worded note, a visit from the ambassador, and then strikes. The thing is, the strongly worded note, the visit from the ambassador, followed by a visit from a warship to go, excuse me, we really are keeping an eye on this, followed by another visit from the ambassador, followed by then strikes, would seem to be a stronger messaging technique. Turning 343. The Dutch had a few PC-2000 stationed in Afghanistan. Really helped persuade unwanted gangs to scuttle over or get a few grenades fired from 20 kilometers away. Sewish, the US geological surveys from 10 years ago, touting trillions in Afghan wealth. Not one mine built yet. Never happens with unstable governments. True, but also never happens if you have no way of getting the resources out of there. You cannot fly those resources out of there. If you built a railway, you could get the mining equipment in, which is very heavy and expensive anyway, to do to start the mines, and B, the stuff out, which would create an economy. It's infrastructure. Build the railway, which America should have thought of, because that's how America was forged. Let's be honest. America is a population on the west coast, a massive population on the east coast, and so there's a gold rush. Then there's a few more people going to the west, but that's all by ship, and that's quite long and dangerous and hazardous because it's pre the Panama Canal. And then they build these railways, and then they forge settlements along the routes of the railways, and that's how America develops. So you'd think a nation which developed thanks to railways would sit there, and when they're looking at another nation which they had taken custodianship of, and would go, you know what they need? Railways. We'll build them. But no, America is nowadays obsessed with the trucker, and thought that was the sensible road haulage. But the trouble is, to support a road haulage network and depend upon roads, you need a lot more than you need for railways. Which always sounds counterintuitive to people, because people think, well, you know, in Britain we see it running around. But that's because the road haulage network was built on an existing network which was developed prior to that. So support its development and its infrastructure. But there is still a massive movement of goods by rail, even in modern Britain and in modern Europe and in modern America. There is still a huge movement going. So just sticking in a road network is not going to be enough. And if you are moving heavy duty supplies, which are large bulk, low price, or large volume, and you want a large volume, low cost way of moving it, railways. to get into ports and move them around the world. So it would have made money for Pakistan. Also, the point it also makes, if you hook up these railways and you stick them into neighbouring nations and the goods are going out through them, then suddenly those nations are going, hang on, we're getting money because this stuff is going backwards and forwards. That money is tied to it being continuing to be stable in Afghanistan. Okay, suddenly we are in favour of it being stable in Afghanistan. We don't really want to cause as much trouble there as we might otherwise be happy to cause, because at the moment it doesn't affect us if there's any problems. But if we're hooked up to it by a railway, suddenly that stability becomes important. And who cares if you build a railway into China? That'd be one of the first railways I'd have built. Would be a railway from Afghanistan into China. Make sure the Chinese are connected into it, so they want it to be nice and stable, because then they'll help make sure the Pakistanis keep nice and stable and the Iranians keep nice and stable, because neither of them want to piss off both the Americans and the Chinese. You piss off one or the other at the same time. Excuse the French, anyone or any of my cousins listening. You do not want to do both. John Luke. About guy 89, China might go in and build railways for the future mining operations. They might well do. John Luke, build back glorious Royal Navy better. Third carrier, please. That'd be nice. Peter Dawson, I'm sure it's possible for C-17 to carry Challenger tank. However, it does have to have fuel in the aircraft as well, and the aircraft is limited in total weight it can carry. I think it can. I'm fairly sure I've seen them take a Challenger up. I'm not sure whether the Challenger was fully loaded with ammunition and everything else. I think the Challenger was running about as empty and as light as it could possibly be. Right. So no one is going to stay 3 to 4 billion in infrastructure just to get to a mining site without a stable government. No, but it would have been a sensible thing for the US government to invest in building that infrastructure in Afghanistan to stabilise it. Anyway, it's getting off the 1966 paper, but this one is just as short-sighted. Carmen, would a warrior or scorpion have been as useful in force protection as guns, still more powerful than I think certain people have usually? A warrior might have been. Remember, scorpions are no longer in service. We have, I think it's scimitars we use now, which are the same gun as a warrior. Graham Handler, Palmerston, gunboat diplomacy going on to Jingoism and Jingoism and Israeli. Don't build a railway. Yeah, well, that's the other thing you do. You get the Afghans to build a railway. You pay for it to be built. Again, that's something you could have Afghanistan could have afforded to build it. John Wood, does the railway tie you to protecting it, as the Turks had to in Arabia in 1418? To an extent, but economically, again, it's going to sound strange. Everyone becomes the more useful the railway is, the more everyone's interests are that the railway keeps going. So again, let's put it this way. Let's say someone attacked the railway into China. Yes, you might be having to deal with the Afghan authorities, but you'd probably also be having to deal with the upset Chinese authorities and the upset American authorities. There are three groups now. There are times in life when it's worthwhile making the trouble. There's times when it's not. John Luke, I think the expectation that someone going to Afghanistan, China, for anything other than rigorous chat about the benefits of Taliban rule, probably be very disappointed. Potentially. Ironhide X-ray. Well, they did try to build the ring road, and contraction crew would constantly get attacked. Wouldn't rail pretty much have the same problem? Yes and no. It's going to sound strange, but it's almost quicker to lay railways and roads sometimes. And again, it's if you get the locals to build them, and the locals are tied into building them. They managed to build dams and things. They could have built the railways. You wouldn't have to do the same as you did and wouldn't have to do it the same way, and hopefully would not do it the same way as 1890s Africa or the other things. As said, it would have been a tangible improvement for the local population. Vision: America has forgotten how to build infrastructure since the Interstates. Apollo, New Deal, dams, bridges, Panama Canal, and the railroads. Even HS2 is going to get going a lot better than HSR in California. Jingles and Chieftain are always welcome on build farms. That's the point. They're always welcome. Right then. So, let's get into this one. Here's the next thing. Next part. We plan to reduce substantially the deployment of forces in the Mediterranean. From 1968, we shall give up the Aden near base and confine our presence in the Middle East to the Persian Gulf. In the Far East, we should cut level our forces once confrontation is over, and within a few years, we shall maintain no forces permanently deployed in the Caribbean or the Southern Africa. We shall be able to keep our forces in Germany at the present size only if the foreign exchange costs are met. We have made it clear that in future, Britain will not accept commitments overseas which might require her to undertake major operations of war without cooperation of allies, nor shall we attempt to maintain defence facilities in any independent country against its wishes. Now, as I said in the recorded video, I have no problems with the last part of the last sentence. Nor shall we attempt to maintain defence facilities in any independent country against its wishes. It is sensible. It is fine. The rest of the paragraph, though, let's get into that. The rest of the paragraph, let's see. We are going to reduce the deployment of forces in the Mediterranean. Cyprus, anyone? All sorts of issues going on there. And then we have later on Libya and all these things. Britain has never been able to really reduce its scale of presence in the Mediterranean. And also, to this day, still, a lot of our maritime sea trade goes through the Mediterranean. We are dependent upon it as our trade routes. Okay. All right. So maybe we're relying on the French, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, and the Turks to look after our trade interests there, plus the American fleet based in the Mediterranean. Yeah, that's what we're relying on. All right, I can to an extent understand that. The Middle East and the Persian Gulf, well, yeah, that worked well. I can understand getting rid of Aden, but we're now having to build up Bahrain and Singapore again because we're having to go back there because we have huge interests in the region. And we had them then, we have them now. And we shall maintain no force permanently deployed in the Caribbean. Well, in the Caribbean, excuse me, there is hurricane season, and these are Commonwealth citizens we tend to feel responsible for. We have huge connections with. You have all sorts of wind rush and other things going on, which are increasing our connections with that area. We owe them a blood debt from fighting for us in 2 world wars. You're honestly telling me you don't want to have forces out there in hurricane season to help them? Really? Of course you don't, because you're domestically focused. South Africa, well, again, our presence wasn't really helping there, but we could have done more. But it wasn't really helping, so you can argue that one. However, these are the 2 things. One, we shall be able to keep our forces in Germany at the present size only if the foreign exchange costs are met. Well, I thought this was about restructuring and refocusing on the Central Front. This is what people always tell me. It's about sensible strategy. It's refocusing on the Central Front. Only if our costs are met. If they're not, then we're cutting those forces. And finally,
We have made it clear that in future, Britain will not accept commitments overseas which might require it to undertake major operations of war without the cooperation of allies. I never knew a country could tell everyone else that they just weren't going to go to war. You can take this in one way. Either this is Britain saying, we don't defend any of our foreign territories anywhere in the world at all, so free for all, come and take it, we're not going to do anything about it. Or we're saying, because we're saying it so, no one will come after anything we have. I have no idea which one it is, but it's one of those two. It sounds sensible, and honestly, you get similar lines in pretty much every defense paper ever since, which usually justifies some of the most breathtaking cuts. We will only go to war with allies. We will only go to war alongside this group, and then we end up going to war on our own. Or we go to war and the allies that we were relying on for those capabilities don't come. And you sit there and go, you can't. I'm sorry. It's a nice way of trying to save money and thinking about it. But ultimately, a country can only rely on itself to defend its own interests. As much as pretty words are lovely, you can't. And that these days is taken as being one side of the political spectrum. But if you're talking in the 1920s and 30s, that was understood across all the political spectrum. It wasn't considered a bad thing because countries ultimately look after the interests of their population first, above and beyond what they're going to worry about allies. And if there's no good justification for them going to war, they're not going to. But if there's a justification for you going to war, you better be prepared to do it. P. Dawson, aircraft are limited to maximum takeoff weight to maximum design landing weight. Realistically, they only need enough fuel in tanks to make it to the tanker orbiting overhead, where it can proceed to chug fuel. Yeah. Carmen, we'll be less deployed there, and not constantly having a ship in the med. Yeah. That's not a never given. It's an interesting one. And this is only the first paragraph of this chat page. We haven't even got into the next paragraphs yet. This is good. Every wild west town decided it's better to hunt down the baddies than to risk having a train be behind schedule. Pretty much. Right. Against this background, we have taken certain major decisions on equipment of our forces. The Canberra strike reconnaissance aircraft must be replaced by 1970. The Anglo-French variable geometry aircraft, which is the core of our long-term operational and industrial aircraft programs, will not be available until the mid-1970s. Before anyone asks, yes, that wasn't Jaguar. That was the program which eventually would lead to Tornado. We have decided that the only way of bridging the gap is to buy the smallest possible number of F-111As from the United States and to supplement these aircraft with the V-bombers, which will be released from their current strategic role when the Polaris submarine force is fully operational. The foreign exchange cost of the F-111A purchase was met by sales of British equipment to the United States and to third countries. So, please note, they are retiring the Canberra. Okay. The aircraft they are supposed to replace the Canberra is being delayed and ending service.
They are therefore going to use V-bombers, which we'll get into later, the practicalities of using them for reconnaissance aircraft. We will get into that later. Supplemented by F-111As. Now, I love the Aardvark. The Aardvark is a wonderful aircraft. However, they're not exactly cheap, even in their time. And the point is, the smallest possible number, and these are the foreign exchange cost of the F-111A's purchase will be met by sales of British equipment to the United States and to third countries. So, A, you're saying the smallest possible number, and B, you're saying only if you get enough money from selling other things. And that's before we get into the actual text. As Dennis Healy, and I do feel sorry for him at certain points, although he's being quite rude to some people over it, it gets cross-examined as it goes on. This is not a good thing for him. He has to deal with a lot of people pointing out that technically that isn't even what was said. Because what's originally put in the white paper is that it will be paid for by a loan, and then that loan will be repaid by foreign military sales. But Dennis Healy changes it. That they will first get the money from the foreign military sales and then pay for it. And of course, as we all know, in the supplementary 1968 paper, which, let's see, 1968, that's fairly close to 3,000 million, I would say, in defense spending. 1968, they cut the F-111. Okay. Baron Freeman, is the problem with funding the RN the move away from the British Merchant Navy not doing a lot of mercantile shipping and Lloyd's of London the insurance, so not having a decent navy was unacceptable? To an extent. To an extent. John Luke, we'll work with our allies. It will be so great. France will lend us their carriers on tick when we need it. The French government spontaneously forgets English and becomes deaf, blind, and mute. Not quite that bad. But yeah, it's always interesting. Graham Hanna, Hilly kicking the can down the road to play it's a domestic policy, and as you said, kinda, who held the voice in the Labour Party at the time? It's the domestic policy. Aircraft with an entire crew ejection capsule tend to not be inexpensive. Ian Carr, was TSR2 cancelled prior to this? Well, here is the interesting thing. BSR2 was cancelled. TSR2 was cancelled, I mean. In well, was cancelled before the 1966 Defence Review. Really. It was cancelled in 1965 on grounds of project cost. So the Air Force had already lost their new heavy bomber. Thank you. Sorry. Moths and my books are not going together. But, yeah. The Aardvark is what's going to come. And as Melanie 64 has pointed out, entire crew ejection capsules are not usually that cheap. Jermac, foreign exchange costs. Wasn't this a period or start of a period where UK economy was choked by trade balance problems? They were certainly an issue, but often the government, how to put it, they become more of an issue about things the government doesn't want to pay for than things the government does want to pay for. Hey Dawson, Clarke, the cameras were still in service in the 1980s when the Falklands War was on, and when we destroyed an Argentinian camera, we realised ours were also obsolete. To an extent, but remember, they're theoretically being cut by this, and the F11's supposed to replace them, and then they are kept in service because the F11, and that makes the F11 not needed. After one, they're not needed. Senator, what is your opinion of flag of convenience merchant shipping? You can't get rid of it. It's going to be there. I'd like some tougher standards, and I'd like especially some tougher standards for looking after merchant crews, but... Anyway, we shall keep our existing carrier force as long as possible, into the 1970s, but we shall not order a new carrier. In the light of the military task envisaged and of the operational return we can expect from its cost of 1,400 million over the next 10 years, we do not believe that we should be justified in keeping a carrier force indefinitely. A new carrier could not be operational until 1973, when the rest of our carriers would be in the last phase of their active life. But by the mid-1970s, we should be able to re-provide the necessary elements of the carrier's capability more cheaply by other means. How? The carrier is your strike, airborne early warning, fleet fighter, outer fighter defense, and anti-submarine warfare helicopter asset. How are you going to provide that from other means? What are you providing that from? In a nice way, you're cancelling the Type 82 program at the same time. So you're cancelling the big destroyer, which might have provided you air defense, and you're cancelling the carrier. And let's be honest, let's take this figure. 1.4 billion, or 1,400 million in those days, as they discussed it. And let's go and look at the facts. Okay, so over 10 years is 140 million a year for running the carrier force. And I am more and more convinced that this figure is a very interesting sum. Because the more and more I look into it, the more and more I'm fairly sure it includes the costs of maintaining the infrastructure, the costs of which the whole ports. I'm talking about the whole of Portsmouth and Poole and Plymouth. I'm thinking that the hot cost of all three of them were included in this cost. The cost of maintaining the carrier's forward basing, even though you said you're not going to be doing that in the Far East and various other things. Remember, Hermes was out in the Far East. The cost of all the aircraft, all the things, everything. And I still haven't been able to make it reach 140 million a year. So I don't know where that's coming from. I don't know where this figure is coming from. I am sure, because he is many things, and I do call him selective in his facts, Dennis is not a liar. He is many things, but Dennis Healy is not an out-and-out liar. So, my thinking is he has got this figure from somewhere by combining some figures together so he can make it a defensible claim. I don't know what it is. Perhaps he's combining the cost of procuring new carriers into it. I honestly don't know where he's getting the 140 million from a year. But out of a defense budget which rises to nearly 3,000 million a year, 140 million would be, let's see, well, it would be 0.7% on 2,000 million, which was his original target. So that would have been an interesting one. No, 7%, not 0.7%. But on nearly 3, well, let's say 2.8. 2,800 million, as some of the figures are. 140? We're talking already a 20th, so 5% of the budget? 5% of the defence budget to run 4 aircraft carriers. I'm not sure, but I'm fairly sure if Margaret Thatcher had been told that she could maintained it and probably deterred conflict as easily as she could have done with it, yeah, she'd have been happy to have seen it spent. And the final one. I believe that the majority of the House recognises that it has become essential to stop the automatic rise in British defence expenditure. It's rising. A little bit. It's rising in terms of real term cost, yes, but let's go here. It's definitely falling in terms of percentage of GDP. So he is right. It's rising in terms of real term cost, i.e. the figure being given for it, but as a percentage of GDP, it's smaller. It's dropping. As a result of their defence review, Her Majesty's government have found a way of doing so without defaulting on Britain's Commonwealth commitments to our allies and partners in the Commonwealth. Well, at least not until the carriers retire in the late 1970s, but by that point, this is of course mid-1960s, he's presuming he's not going to be the government in power. And without abandoning her influence either inside or outside Europe. You're literally withdrawing from outside of Europe. You're announcing you're withdrawing from the world, pretty much. So, yeah, you're losing influence. And those who believe we have failed to bring our commitments and resources into proper balance must have the courage to say whether, in their view, the government should spend more on defence and where they will get the money, or cut Britain's commitments further, and if so, where. Well, as always, it goes back to this. This is about rebalancing defence expenditure. And if you look at the mid-1960s, they've already been growing, but they start to really pick up growing. Health care, education, welfare, which they should pick up, and defence starts to drop as a percentage of GDP. This is the point. Always worry when politicians start talking about real terms. That means that probably they are not keeping pace with inflation. When they start talking GDP, that means they are going to have to go for a massive real term rise, and they don't want to scare people. Or they're going for a real term drop, and they don't want to scare people. We are still maintaining 2% of our GDP being spent. Yes. How? Always watch the exact figure given, because you can shift, and you can shift the goalposts. Graham Hanna, am I sensing 66 bid us in 82, and that if they do the same again, we're going to get some backside again, get sore backside again? Yeah. But the British government doesn't seem to be doing the 66 at the moment. They're doing some nutty things, but honestly, the biggest problem they've got is the Ajax program, which is probably going to bite us in the butt if we have anything in Eastern Europe we have to deal with. And the other problem that's going to cause us trouble is if we don't have enough escorts in service. So we're going to have to work on that one, and amphibious lift. But, we can sort these things out. Benjamin, is it time to bring up the RS favourite and our second favourite Blackburn aircraft, the Buccaneer? Yeah. The Blackburn Buccaneer was transferred from the Fleet Air Arm to the Royal Air Force and used as a substitute for the F-111. Proved very capable, and as Ian Carr said, the RAF had not wanted them. Interesting enough, if the RAF had been investing in buying Buccaneers before, earlier on, which they could have started joining the Buccaneer program far earlier with the Royal Navy, with the Fleet Air Arm, that would have probably would have meant that the RAF would have had an incentive to support the carriers, because if the Royal Navy gets out of the aircraft game, that would increase the cost of operating Buccaneers for them, because it wouldn't make it joint service. 1960-40. This is what, a decade after the Suez Crisis? Did the currency exchange rate recover or not really? It had recovered, but then it went down and it recovered. There was all sorts of things, but it was, as I said, a decade after Suez. People often use Suez as the point at which British influence around the world starts to drop down. I would argue it's actually 1966. And the trouble is, when we look back, we don't want to make it 1966, because that's the year we associate with a great football victory, which is lovely, but the trouble is, it doesn't matter in the end in terms of international relations. That's the defense white paper. See, Winish, in those days, the UK's main NATO concern was anti-submarine naval raid. The Royal Navy's priorities in any war was to support the UK, UK Iceland Greenland gap, to reinforce Norway, and to protect convoys. The carrier groups, believe it or not, were part of the British strike force, which would assist the Americans with the UK Iceland Greenland gap. The idea was that the British carrier groups, the American carrier groups, and the French carrier groups would all form up together in a massive Atlantic carrier task force under Commander Atlantic Fleet, the Commander Carrier Force Atlantic, pretty much. Or Commander Strike Fleet Atlantic, I think he ends up being called, but they change around titles. And basically, they would forge up into the high north, fighting off Soviet submarines, dodging the blackjacks and other vicious Soviet heavy bombers, and would launch crushing strikes at Karla and all the other places in the Soviet Union, and would show the supreme power of the Western naval might, and would therefore stop the submarines going and fighting and attacking the convoys, because they'd be too busy defending the motherland. No one ever told the Russians that when they were buying a load of whiskies. Hello, Frank Spazzato. Frank Spazzato, is there an important lesson from Suez that you feel is not talked about enough? That it actually happened. Suez is bad politically, and yeah, we shouldn't. It's not something which we should really sort of talk about repeating. But, and I say this with all the things, the fact is, Britain and France managed to do it, and militarily, they pretty much won. If it wasn't for America stepping in when they did, there's always the joke that the Soviet Union was going to get involved. And the Soviet Union was certainly threatening, but what could they do about it, really? The Soviet Union, yes, we have... What? What's going to take on the massed fleet the British and the French have there? And did the Soviet Union really want a war with the other two nuclear powers in NATO? It might cause a schism in NATO, but they can't really use nuclear weapons because they'll be sent back at them. So it's going to be something else. Hello, Stafford Thompson. Oh, sure. Silly question. The 1923 Picturn PCA-2 gets a bit of serious attention from the UK, US, and Japan. How does the support carrier and fleet carrier develop with these things in mind? If the Pitcairn gets more issues in 1923, then you're probably looking at British pushing for carriers to be far bigger than they were, so they could carry more fuel, longer range, and more operations for aircraft. If they think they're going to have to be operating in the center of the Pacific, as well as the South China Sea and East China Sea and the Western Pacific. Frank, I think the US fear was Soviets having something to say about imperialism. I think the US fear, the big one in 1956, was actually that, hang on, we thought we got it to the point where our allies couldn't do anything without us saying so. They thought that, you see, to an extent, the Americans inherit the British position as prima inter pares of the Western world. And they thought that meant that no one else could do anything without you telling them what to do. Whereas it actually, as the British often would have pointed out to the Americans if they inquired at any point, it actually meant often that you couldn't really, they could do what they liked, but as with 1956, if you say stop it, they're supposed to stop it and pull back. It's not quite that bad. But no, it's an interesting time, definitely. And if we go to Hansard, and please note, if you look down in the description, you will find a link to Hansard. You also find links to the other Long Patrol, and to actually this, because I copied and pasted both. Bam, bam. So that should all be down there. But it's interesting. Now, the reason I bring up Hansard and the reason I'm going to start talking about it now is I want to talk about some of the points made about it. And my first one is going to be from a gentleman who is most famous for a speech he makes called The Rivers of Blood, which is really not a good speech. And no, there are many, many issues going on with him. However, on this occasion, he makes actually a fairly decent point. It's always possible. He says, is the right honourable gentleman, who less than a week ago was saying that he did not expect any resignation on the Navy side because of the defence white paper, aware that it is neither practical nor appropriate to rely point by point at this stage to his fly point by point at this stage to his long and tenacious statement? Is he aware that not only this side of the House, but the whole of the country will study carefully and anxiously the outcome and implications of the government's 15-month-long review? But is it not already evident that the nature of some decisions and the timing of others has been forced upon the government by their own absurd preoccupation with fudging a figure of 2,000 million in 1969 to 70, regardless of the consequences for the morale of services or the defence of the country? Healy goes on and all sorts of things. Well, let's start off with this is why Healy gets a point of being rude in this debate. I'm surprised that the right honourable gentleman should have made the last point, since he himself resigned from the previous government because they did not fix a limit for defence expenditure. On the question of resignations, on which the Right Honourable Gentleman is indeed an expert, I would like to say this. Nobody could have fought harder than my honourable friend, the member for Woolwich East, Mr. Mayhew, to see that the Royal Navy got more equipment to use east of Suez, even though this meant that the defence budget should rise above the ceiling of 2,000 million. And I regret that my honourable friend should have found it necessary to resign because the Chiefs of Staff, I myself, and the government were unable to accept his advice. I think that many of us in the House recognise integrity when we see it, and that my honourable friend has shown great courage in taking the step he has. Those who, like me, applaud his courage would like to know how the Right Honourable Member for Wolverhampton, South West, Mr. Powell, can remain a member of the front bench of a party shortly to stand at an election where he disagrees with its defence policy, its foreign policy, its social policy, and its economic policy. At this point, then, Mr. Maxwell Hislop, on a point of order, is it in order for the Secretary of State to report to the House what the Chiefs of Staff were or were not prepared to agree to? In other words, technical advice, when honourable members are not allowed to table questions asking what advice is or is not given to the Minister by the Chiefs of Staff. Speaker, I have heard nothing out of order yet. Mr. Healy, the Defence Secretary. Mr. Speaker, if I may make a comment on that, I am following a precedent set by the Right Honourable Member for Monmouth, Mr. Thornycroft. It is a precedent which I have never regarded as a fortunate one, and which I do not intend to follow on another occasion. But I feel it essential, for the good of the future Navy, to make it clear to the Navy that the Admiralty Board did not assent to the decision which the government have taken on this issue, and if I were obliged, as I think I was, to make the Board's position clear, I think that I was similarly under an obligation to make clear the views of the other members of the Chief of Staff Committee. And then Mr. Heath, leader of the Conservatives, says, is the Secretary of Defence aware that he has made a statement which was the most momentous implications for the future of defence in this country and for Britain's place in the world as a whole? It is regrettable that the Right Honourable Gentleman should have reduced such a statement in his answers to supplementary questions to the level of personal attacks, since he has made the statement not only against the background of the resignation of a minister, but of the constitutional crisis out of the resignation of the First Sea Lord. Ouch. And this is their reconnaissance aircraft, an Avro Vulcan. Yeah, we want that doing low-level, high-speed reconnaissance. Ouch. Oh. For sure, it's a flying car like the pit can takes more gas than a plane. Richard, I thought you were talking about. You've got PCA2 there. I just didn't notice that. I thought you were talking about the 1923 Pitcairn in the islands. But if you're talking about the little flying car, I have no idea. If you get a flying car, then I presume that creates something like an LHD or an LHP earlier. Apologies. And why did the US take the stop-it approach in 56? Because they needed to show how powerful they were. I guess in car, use of Mediterranean would need shortly after 1966 to be reassessed by Arab-Israeli Six-Day War, closing the Suez Canal for a period, increasing size of ships. Much later, Suez Canal was widened. There were all sorts of issues which came with it. When did Churchill come back as PM after World War II? It was 1951, I think. Engaging strategy. How did I not know this was going on until right now? You missed the advertisements? I don't know. Do you have the little bell pressed? Yes. You know, I was tweeting about it earlier. So was Stafford. I think I tweeted about it. I might have been tweeting about my book instead. There's already been a video come out about this today already, Engaging Strategy, a recorded one. Right. I'll be back in a second. Someone's just knocking on my door.
And back. So, it's one of those things which is just interesting. It really is. And it just keeps going on like that. Sorry, I didn't realize, wasn't sure what was going on for a second because for some reason, my studio screen, which is just there, had frozen, and I thought everything else had frozen. And then I realized for some reason it paused. I have no idea why it paused. I really don't. It was just trying to give me a panic attack. So, here is the Arbor Vulcan. And here is the problem for the British and the problem for the TSR-2. As I said in the recorded video, the RAF links them permanently in terms of making them to the nuclear bomb. That is the big thing. They are about the nuclear bomb. They are about providing that capability and that nuclear deterrent. Hello, Nook. Well, how do I put this? Therefore, when Polaris came into service, they were considered surplus requirements. And James Hanley has put, I'm pretty sure Vulcans were used for maritime reconnaissance and ended up being reasonably effective in the role. Not really. They were occasionally used for it, but there were things called Nimrods wandering around, which were used for it far more often. Vulcans weren't really used for maritime because they didn't upgrade their systems to really be able to strike ships that well with modern missiles. This is the thing. You could have done it, but they didn't. Frank Spardo, Canberra, Moscow. Okay. Richard, okay, it's okay. Thank you. I'm working on a fantasy fleet in my head. Concrete sloops, flying car carriers. Then just find me a 3D printer later. Frank Spardo, why did the UK stop when the US said so at Suez? It's often linked to loans and dire straits. The UK economy wasn't in those dire straits. And it wasn't necessarily the US threatening to withhold a vital loan. There were other factors which were part of it. The actual loan was not, that is often used as the figure is not that much. It was more a case of Britain had thought it had American support and American agreement, because Britain had gone to America and France had gone to America and told them pretty much what they were doing, and American personnel and British which worked with the British fleet, and American personnel which worked with the French fleet had told the Americans what the British and French were doing, and the British and French had thought that they had permission. They basically, well, not had permission, but that Americans didn't mind about doing it. And then the Americans suddenly, to them, changed their mind. And the British were going, well, let's be honest. We'd like Suez back, but is this worth making a bad relationship with the Americans? No. Not at the moment. And not when we're dealing with Soviet Union with all this nuttiness. So, boom. And in many ways, it's going to sound strange, but the loan is a face-saving thing for the British because it provides them with a reason beyond which that, honestly, we value the American friendship more than the French. It was awesome. The Vulcans in post-1970 low-level camouflage. That Vulcans in post-1970 low-level camouflage. Not appropriate for this time frame. Also, Vulcans did become maritime recon aircraft with 27 Squadron.
as said, they were badged as maritime recon aircraft. They were badged as many things to try and protect them. They weren't necessarily that brilliant at it. It happens, but it's not really a reconnaissance aircraft. And as in Kara's point, Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft was introduced in 1969. Oi, caramba. They're always fun. So here is the point. You are dealing with a changing world. Britain is no longer this empire, but it still has disinterests. That's often the problem when you have to explain to people. Yes, the former empire has gone, but Britain still has strong ties of blood and history with the Canadians, 2 world wars, and various other things as well. They fought alongside us. So many Americans. And this is all the parts that were pretty much out part of Britain's empire at various points. There's even parts of here that's America by the time Britain's at its peak, but the empire's at its peak. But you know, Britain still has its Arctic territories. It still has the Falklands. It still has the Pitcairn Islands. Still has all sorts of little islands around the world, which are British overseas territories. It has strong connections to the Caribbean. Has strong connections to Southeast Asia. All through Africa, India, Middle East, Far East. It has strong connections. And the reason it has strong connections is it has trade going on. Even when America replaces Britain as the world's #1 market and #1 economy exporting, British economy and British trade is still very strong. And to an extent, British governments have made a decision since 1966, a constant decision, a conscious decision, that as America's dependent upon these areas for trade, we can afford, to an extent, to refocus our spending, hence this, on domestic priorities and other priorities other than defence, because in the nicest way, ours is a top-up upon the level of security which America is providing. Which is fine as long as America's providing it. And that is fine because America suits our purposes. They are a relatively liberal democracy that is a global power, that is relatively open, has the rule of law, all sorts of things that we recognize. It recognizes the treaties. It does things the way we recognize and in the system we originally set up. They have replaced us in that system, but they've kept largely to the system which we helped build, which benefits us. It's in our self-interest. Now, people are going to sit there and go, but that's terrible. Da, 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 da. It isn't. In a nice way, it's the nation's self-interest. It's to be in a system which they've set up, which benefits their self-interest. It's not nice for other nations. I have to agree that they want to change it. But the trouble is, what do they change the system to, and how they're going to change it? And in the end, if you let another country rewrite it, they'll just rewrite it to benefit them. So that's the thing. Do you try and do work in the existing system you know, which you understand, or do you try to create a different system? The original idea, of course, was to bring everyone into this system, and therefore they would be parts of the existing system, so they'd be wedded to it. It doesn't always work that way. But this is the British Empire at its peak. And of course, you have the audacious class HMS Ark Royal, which the decision is made in 1966 not to replace her, but she serves through to 1979. So let's be honest, if you have been talking about the brand new carriers entering service in 1933, maybe another one in 1937, and another one in 1973, 1977, and then 1981, the Royal Navy would have had 3 great carriers, and they'd have been able to maintain their operations going on with CBA-1 quite happily. They could have transferred things across. It would have been viable. Hammond. Global Britain, when you think about it, is really quite old, and it's a shame we didn't look after our Navy until now, where it's finally getting the ships it needs. I hope for part to get 12 destroyers, not 6 next time. We can hope. Next one. Are there any nations today that want to rejoin with the UK? The Commonwealth is a vibrant organisation, but we have to watch it because there are other nations out there which would seek to disrupt the Commonwealth because it causes problems for them. In that it means the elites tend to have access to other potential sources of information and sucker. Yes, I remember Nimrod now, but wasn't it in service in 1966 for I think it was Shackleton 4 Turboprots. They were in service in 1966, but Nimrod was on the books to be developed. Comes in service in 1969. The Shackleton hung around everywhere. This was a cool aircraft carrier, and it was a useful aircraft carrier for the Royal Navy and for Britain. Remember, I have given the example as well before, but there is the whole book about her surging across to Guatemala and Honduras to stop war. To stop a war with overflying aircraft. That is what an aircraft carrier can do. It's a projection tool. It can go around the world and give you tactical aircraft. And the thing is, this is the point I tend to make when you're looking at strategic bombers versus aircraft carriers. I go, you need both, really. You do. You can make the case for having both. You don't need to make it an either-or scenario because they actually do different roles. One turns up with a massive load of bombs, drops a huge amount of ordnance, and then goes home. And if you want to maintain one of those constantly in the air, that's going to require a very large number of aircraft over your target because it'll be operating at long range. However, if you want constant air in the air, you want aircraft constantly in the air, armed and ready to fire, you probably want an aircraft carrier because you can take that closer, you can support the latest aircraft, and you can keep them up in the air because it's an airbase. Because the aircraft can land and rearm because they can refuel in air, but they cannot yet rearm in midair, so they need to come down somewhere. Carriers are nice support for that. Combine the two, you have occasionally huge dollops of ordnance turning up from extremely long range, able to be supported nicely from a land airbase that is well away from the trouble zone. And you have the carrier, which is nice and secure for different reasons. And the carrier brings along not only strike capability and combat air support, but also a lovely dose of maritime sea control, which can be helpful, especially if it's task group. Anuk, coming in late. What's the difference between a colony and overseas territory? British overseas territories are things like the Falkland Islands. They are self-governing in pretty much every area but foreign policy, and we may or may not have someone there who's called the governor. I think we've changed the titles of them now to make various other nations happier with it. James Headley, Phoenix Squadron. Thank you for reminding me. I knew I'd forgotten the art of the actual book and the name of the book. I could remember it was by Roman White, but I couldn't remember the actual book name. Thank you. Next one. Does the UK still build its own missiles and aircraft anymore? We build large chunks of the Eurofighter. We build large chunks of Airbus. We still build certain aircraft and helicopters in entirety. Mostly things like the Hawk and some of the UAVs and some of the and Lynx and sort of Merlin. Missiles, yes, some of them we build ourselves. we do have some for manufacturing purposes at least. Carmen, off topic. Have you got the new re-release of David Fletcher's British tank development of World War II? It's very good and affordable. I don't know if I have a new re-release. I certainly have British tanks of World War II. I have British-made tanks of World War II down here, which I've done a review on. Osprey one. You will find it in the book or two to review. I think it's episode 20 of book or two to review. Engaging strategy. The thing I find interesting from 1965-66 large carrier and med bomber debate is how myopically focused east of Suez it was, despite the clear relevance of both in the NATO area. Something that has, unfortunately, poisoned the UK's debate on carriers ever since, where they're assumed by default to have little relevance in Europe. Yep, there was that stupidity. Again, the thing is, what does the carrier give you in Europe? It gives you an airbase which will probably still be alive on day 2 or 3. Because most of the air bases in range of your targets are going to be hit on day 1 because, well, you can find them on an Ordnance Survey map or a Google map nowadays. What is your opinion of the Osprey helicopter? I think it's a lovely first-generation tilt rotor. I think the son of Osprey will be an interesting, or daughter of Osprey, whatever they call it, next generation, because they're pretty much rebuilding it. And I think tilt rotors are a nice idea, but I don't support the Royal Navy buying them yet. Because this is going to sound like a broken record, because I've said this so many times before, but it comes down to logistics. And currently, the aircraft carriers are focused on F-35s and Merlins, with occasional visits of Chinooks and other things, but those are visitors. So that means that's your air group you have to support and carry supplies for, 2 types of aircraft. You have a fixed amount of space to carry supplies. You have a fixed amount of storage space. If you have 2 types of aircraft, you can carry far more supplies for those types of aircraft. You can carry far more supplies in general to support them. And I think really it's only once you can start maybe 3D printing large amounts of supplies and parts for aircraft that you're going to see a return to the idea of having penny packets of aircraft on carriers. Because logistically and mechanically, you can you can support far more on far less if you can have a few general purpose systems. Now, whether or not the Merlin is replaced by a tilt rotor aircraft, that's a completely different matter. There are potentially several tilt rotor designs which could be used and could be developed to replace the Merlin, and it might be worthwhile looking into them. But that's a time away, or a coaxial rotor type. Thanks. I'll look into it and send you a link to the Thank You Zoom page. Thank you. Roland White's. I'm not Roland White's favourite book. The ending is a bit anticlimactic, but a thoroughly good read all the same. Yes. Well, the trouble is the history is a bit anticlimactic. That's the problem. So the ending is at least accurate to the history. Come on, episode 20 was on 4C, then it'll be episode 19 or 18, probably. Sorry. Even when assault carriers have small air wings. They do. But Audacious class. And just imagine if she'd been a Malta class. And then she could have been really useful. Frank's one, which colonies do you wish the British never lost? Which do you think wish the French never lost? The French haven't really. The French, I think, probably better for the. There's large chunks of the world which are still part of France, so they didn't lose all their colonies. And honestly, I think there is part of me which sometimes wishes that instead of turning I don't know, Australia and New Zealand and those sort of places into self-governing states if we hadn't made them part of the UK, like France makes them part of metropolitan Britain. But that's really because I would like to be able to fly to Australia very cheaply on a government-funded internal flight, so government-subsidized internal flight, so I could go and see HMAS Vampire. Same for Canada, so I could go see HMCS Haida. But the reality is, yeah, decolonization happens. There is part of me which thinks it would have been very interesting history-wise if we had let Malta, etc., petition and accepted their petition to join the United Kingdom. I think it would have been very interesting if we'd had Malta as part of Britain. I think if we'd done that and a few more others had a petition like Malta to join Britain, we'd let them all join, like France has various island states around Africa, etc. I think it could have been very interesting because I like Maltese politics. It's quite cool and fun to watch on television sometimes. So it could have been brought a really interesting flair to the House of Commons and might have reformed our own political system a bit. Frank Spanner, answer that one. We should have accepted the result of the referendum that Malta had where they voted to become part of the UK. I think I discovered that. Frank Spanner, there is about 20 years between Hermes and Ark Royal, and another 20 between Hermes and Invincible. Which had the greater leap in technology and design? Also, Dr. C, why 20 years twice? God only knows. Excuse the French there. But honestly, that's just British government's playing up, and Hermes is a light fleet carrier. Ark Royal is an Audacious class fleet carrier. They're both designed and developed really at the same time, so there's no real leap of technology between them. Invincible's technology is interesting. Cynic Canary. Let's change foreign policy for decades to fly a little cheaper. Sounds reasonable. I was asked which ones I wish. Honestly, I don't want any to be a part of Britain. I'm quite happy with them being off on their own, or British overseas territories if that's what they want to be. Self-governing is fine by me, but it's not even my choice. It's theirs, and that should be. But if I'm going to be asked which ones I wish hadn't, I would say literally it's because I wanted to see HMCS Haida and HMS Vampire. So it's entirely self-interested. Re-USN full F-18 carry-ons. Besides, the Superbug began to approach and even surpass the F-14 as a fleet interceptor. Also, the Superbug Hornet compares to the A and even C variants of the force, like Hellcat compares to the Wildcat. To an extent. What is Ark Royal named after? That is an interesting question, Seneca Nero. There are all sorts of things, but basically, the first Ark Royal is a flagship of the English during, originally ordered for Salter Raleigh as the Ark Raleigh, I think. And when it's purchased by the Queen of the Versuses, its name is changed to the Ark Royal. And she is the British flagship, really, when it's fighting the Spanish Armada. So there's a lot of history with the Ark Royal. But, as said, you have a reality going on that the world is changing. And that's something the British are having to deal with, that the world is having to deal with in many respects. Where did I save that to? I've got Ark Royal somewhere. No. Ah. Oh, why have I saved it to there? Bum, bum, bum. Yes, there you go. This is the original Ark Royal. I know we're going off on topic, but here's the original Ark Royal. As said, originally to be called the Ark, then called the Ark Raleigh, then when bought by the Queen becomes the Ark Royal, and that's where we get the name from. Basically, Ark was being used interchangeable for big ship. It's always fun to have a big ship. So, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. This is the other thing that Britain has to deal with in the 1960s. That this is the visible coming threat, the threat that the public keeps hearing about, the threat that worries everyone. So, Britain's gone from being, in nicest way, a country which was thinking about the world to a country which is thinking about Europe and the North Atlantic. And remember, when I talk about 1920s and 30s, I talked about the different navies Britain would need to fight the Italian, and the navy the Royal Navy would have to build to fight the Germans was different than the navy the Royal Navy would have to build to fight the Italians. The navy the Royal Navy would have to build to fight the Japanese. There are differences here, and the trouble for the Royal Navy is it could be any of these three, so it has to build a navy which, as best it can cover all three contingencies, which means it might not be as strong as well prepared against any one of them as it might like to be, because it's got to try and build to be able to deal with the contingency against all three. Or any of those three. Well, if Britain's building up a fleet to fight the Soviets are investing heavily in submarines. The obvious is to go to escorts. Okay? Especially for the convoys, if you're going to be resupplying. But remember, this is also the period that starts to hear the dogma coming in that any war with the Soviet Union is going to immediately go nuclear. And that becomes the trouble again for Britain and a carrier in the North Atlantic. Because what's the point of having carriers for the North Atlantic if the war's just going to go nuclear? There's no chance that Commander Strike Fleet Atlantic is going to be able to get his carriers, his massive carrier groups, into position off Koala, up in the high Arctic, and fighting up there before it's going to go nuclear. There's going to be no convoys going across the Atlantic because they'll never reach Europe in time before it goes nuclear. What's the point in anything? It's just going to go nuclear. And this thinking is affecting things. So actually, strike bombers. Well, yeah, we'll use them, but that'll be like the first day or so. There'll be bombers going on, but after that, it's going to go nuclear. So what's the point of them? You can get some really myopic debates happening. Thanks, Simon. How were UK relations with Turkey during the Cold War? Not that bad. Cool, King George VI. You have a model of World War II HMS Ark Royal. Cool. King George VI. My apologies if you've answered this before, Dr. Clarke, but do you have a favourite British warship of World Wars? Depending on the day of the week, it's either Eskimo or Tartar. Oh, maybe Ashanti. Nubian. Oh, I love Nubian. Basically, I have a top 6, which includes Formidable, the four surviving tribal class destroyers, and HMS Cossack, which of course didn't survive. They're closely followed by about another 12. So really, yes, I have a lot of favourites. Engagement. Also, if we're talking the 1960 review and its many failings, the almost immediate volte-face on the Mediterranean, that other NATO theatre, after withdrawal from East Suez surely ranks. Yep. Realizing that you can't rely on just the French, Italians, Spanish, and Greeks and Turks to do your job for you in the Mediterranean. Engagement 1966 is just going to go nuclear on day one. That is part, I think, of it. That is, honestly, is part of it. Engagement 1968, flexible response. Maybe it's not going to go nuclear on day one after all. Yes, but in 1968 they cut other stuff, which is even less sensible. Basically, the F-111 is held out as a token for the Royal Air Force till 1968. And the point I always make about this whenever we get into this, and whenever I discuss this, is there are people say there are winners and losers in the 1966 Defense White Paper. No, there are just losers. Because if you're a smart Air Force officer, you're going to think if they can cut, literally, the Royal Navy's brand new flagship, which is supposed to be named after HMS Queen Elizabeth, then how much chance do we have of getting this? What will they cut of ours? And also, they're pretty much being told, well, they know that the Nimrod is coming. They know that the strategic bomber role was what's being used to justify the V-Force, and that's been lost. These are being promised on the basis of foreign military sales covering them, the F-111s, and their bomber force is supposed to be hanging around for maritime reconnaissance, and for reconnaissance duties, but Nimrod's coming. They know they're going to lose their bomber force, and a smart person realizes they're not going to get the F-111s. So, yes, maybe their lovely reports were used to justify cutting CVA-01, and the Royal Navy's reports weren't quite as good. But in nicest ways, I've read the Royal Navy reports. They're not spectacular, no, but they're not that bad either. They get locked down into a fight about East of Suez because the government asks them lots of questions about East of Suez. And then the government decides not doing East of Suez, so they cut everything the Royal Navy has pinned pins of East of Suez, pinned on supporting operations East of Suez. It's kind of like a decision in 2010 when the government asked the Royal Navy, what improvements would you like to see made in the Harrier? The Royal Navy, because we're going to have extra money. Okay. It's not 2010, it's about in 2009, 2008. They asked them for a list. And then in 2010, that list of improvements they would like to see in the Harrier is used to, well, these are all the faults in the Harrier, which mean it's a terrible aircraft, so we should get rid of it. And the Navy and the RAF who were involved in the Harrier program were sort of going, what? That's not what that list was for. That list was what things we'd like to see improved. Because you said in 2008 you had some spare money. And we don't need to improve. We can work with it as it is. No. It's terrible. You've shown all these faults. Basically, the government is looking for justifications to do what they want to do. Their purpose, when they started this defence review, was to keep defence spending below £2,000 million. They fail dramatically in that, long term, but they're aiming for that. And they will cut and justify cutting whatever is necessary to make that target, because they wish to spend the money domestically, which isn't wrong. Okay? Governments can prioritise domestic spending. That's fine. They're elected to be a government. But they then have to admit that they are going to change Britain's position in the world. But this government then tries to market that as they're actually improving and strengthening, and Britain isn't losing anything. Of course it is. No one is stupid enough to believe that if you get rid of all the carriers, you are suddenly going to maintain the same influence around the world. You're not. But they're actually trying to sell it. That's an Australian F111 taking off, I think. We don't want to go there. Vision. I would imagine that War the Italians involve a lot of pizza and pasta frying. Not quite, but yeah, good joke. Frank Sonner, who would be the Tom Cruise equivalent if the UK had a Top Gun movie? Oh, good lord. Just as long as it's not Hugh Grant. I'm okay. I can survive with pretty much anyone other than Hugh Grant. Maybe Patrick Stewart. That'd be good. Patrick Stewart as a fighter pilot. I've didn't need decorations for him. I've been accused of having hotel feeling. Drac keeps accusing me of forgetting to paint my office. John Luke, the other 12 include HMS Rodney. Wait till the video comes out. King George VI, being able to throw in, that's a perfect answer, actually. Yeah. That payment. In re-original Ark roll, not take it brought by the Queen Elizabeth, but taken in lieu of taxes. There are all sorts of interesting things around that ship. James Hamley, but more importantly, is HMS Hood among your favourite World War II ships? She's somewhere. Frank Sonner, what was the UK response to the Cuban crisis? Send notes. The UK response to the Cuban crisis was to say to the Americans what we'd like us to do, but there wasn't much we could do because the Americans really didn't want us coming into the Caribbean. But we did have some things turn up in the various area because we have friends in the Caribbean. English VI. Wait, the Royal Navy was given more money intentionally. Occasionally they've given the Royal Navy more money. Occasionally. Do you think that any of the carrier alternatives mooted prior to the decision in 1966 or a firm NATO justification could have made them being cut less likely? No. Think of the Shangri-La option, the smaller, more suboptimal carriers mooted, or simply having the freedom for a much better CVS. I think the only way you could have saved the carriers is if there hadn't been a new build carrier program on the option, but they're trying to save a lot of money, and it's that figure of 140 million. Well, if you think about it, he's talking about he's managed to make savings of 400 million. He's planning on dropping 140 million a year, and that doesn't even make sense. The carrier's 140 million, and he's making savings of 400 million. But the carriers won't be out of service till the 1970s. So he's still spending that money. So honestly, the entire thing doesn't make sense once you start going into it. There is some beautiful phraseology and there is some beautiful stuff in there. And I can think of several young historians who are very good, who will look at the 1966 paper and point out these lovely lines of strategic government judgments in there. And they say how well thought through it is. And I sit there and go, well, that's down to the quality of the civil servants, the quality of the thinkers employed by the Ministry of Defence and various other points. But the reality is, it's making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. And that's it. No, Shane, that is why I dislike politics. Because no one thinks long term. James Harvey, I believe Macmillan had the V-Force on high alert, 15-minute radius, but did not have the order the force to disperse satellite fields across the UK to avoid potentially escalating tensions. Which is my exact point when it comes to things like the idea of having a ballistic missile submarine based in port and would deploy it if necessary. It wouldn't be deployed, so there's no point in having it. You either have a continuous at sea deterrence or you don't have it. Those are your options, which means you either have 4 submarines or you have none. Engagement. The problem with the 1,400 million figure is that includes the air group. The detail is in Ed Hampshire's book, all of which, bar the Gannet AEW replaced by Shackleton AEW, was run on in RAF service. It also includes, when you start going through, and I've gone through Ed Hampshire's book, it's not just including the air group. As I said earlier, it includes the infrastructure on the ports. It includes all sorts of things in the 1,400 million. And that, remember, that figure is over 10 years. It's 140 million a year in a budget of that nearly rises to 2,800 million a year. Seneca, what's saying making a silk purse out of what? What does that even mean? Sal's ear. Look it up. Google it. Melee 6040. Speaking of the F-14, I've been spending time with my mum. It's one of her favourite sayings. Melee 6040. Speaking of the F-14, interesting thing about the AIM-54 is that, with the exception of a sealed variant available in the final 2 decades of service, which limited aircraft speed, the required coolant, which circulated from the aircraft through the missile, the electronics, and back to the aircraft to be cooled and start the process all over again. Johnny, I was always interested in what if the CVA-1 being acquired, what would have been the evolution of carriers from that point, in terms of numbers of fleet, lighter characteristics, whatever. Well, the Royal Navy probably bought about 2 to 3. Depending on government budgets and government priorities, because if you have a gun which is buying 3 CVA-1s, they might still buy 3 Invincibles. Believe it or not. So you might end up with 3 light carriers and 3 fleet carriers wandering around, with the Invincibles probably having an all-Sea King a Sea King air group, and being anti-submarine escorts, and the CVO-1s being strike and ASW escorts carriers. Their air group probably would have included the upgraded from the Gannet, which they were looking at was probably going to be the E2C Hawkeye. But we'll get into that in a second, because, believe it or not, yeah, here it is. This is the Falklands War. That's an Avro Vulcan from flying over Ascension, and from there would go off and bomb the Falklands. Now, the point I make about the Vulcan is it's very, very useful, and having a strategic bomber at that point is very useful. Yes, it doesn't disable the runway. I'm sorry, it doesn't. The runway's still in use. We know Hercules was still landing and taking off from it. But, and the point that cannot be forgotten, is having that heavy bomber capability tied up a lot of Argentinian resources and was a very, very useful asset for psychologically impacting on the Argentinians. Although how it was used was also quite strange, because there were rules like, when it's flying, there can be no Harriers in the air in case they shoot it down. Because the Harriers aren't going to be able to tell the difference between a Vulcan bomber, a massive thing going across, and, I don't know, one of the Argentinian fighters. This is the point, though, with the real point. If you have the Falklands War, and let's say it still happens in 1982, but you still have CVA-1 in service, you more likely have the E2C Hawkeye. The British had already been looking at it and had been talking Grumman at various points about it. So, if you have that in service on CVA-1, that's useful. That is very useful. Because that changes the entirety of the war. If you have a Hawkeye up, and you have Phantoms, which you probably would have, How many Argentine aircraft are actually going to make it through to the Falklands? You want to do an air blockade? You stick up a Hawkeye. You have all the data coming in. That thing orbiting up. You probably take 3 or 4 down on your carrier. You keep at least 2 in the air at any one time if you can, if you have your best choice. One north of the islands, one slightly to the west of the islands, both with caps. There ain't any aircraft getting through to support the Argentinian forces. And you think about it from that point of view. Yes, this might be expensive, but then you think about it, how many ships would Britain have lost under those circumstances? Probably not a lot. Probably a lot less. You are very unlikely to get the Galahad incident. You're very unlikely to get all those incidents. You're very unlikely to have the Atlantic Conveyor incident. You're very unlikely to lose any of the ships in Bomb Alley because the aircraft aren't going to get that close. And maybe, yes, some ships might get still hit by Exocet missiles, but the point is they'll be seen coming a long, long way before they manage to launch the Exocets, in which case the Phantoms will have had a chance to shoot at them. And if they don't hit them, the Sea Dart systems will be up and warned, because that's what the Hawkeye's job is. So this is the thing. The decision is made in 1966, but any government from 1966 onwards, so think about that. (1966) onwards, we have Harold Wilson, of course, is the Prime Minister when it happens, but then Edward Heath, the man who's just opposed these cuts, comes into power in 1970, is in post to 1974. Then it's Harold Wilson again, till 1976. Then it's James Callaghan, till 1979. Then it's Margaret Thatcher, 1979 to 1990. If Margaret Thatcher had in 1979 come in and ordered an aircraft carrier be built, a new fleet carrier, or had ordered the Invincible class expanded, or an airborne early warning version of a helicopter be built to give that capability, it would have been in service by 1982. So, when we talk about the Falklands War, you can blame it on 1966, but in the nicest way, every single government from 1966 onwards could have varying levels have reversed that decision, have changed that decision. And now we have 2 fleet carriers floating around the world. So we have the fleet carriers, but unlike in 1979, 1982, where we had the aircraft but no carriers, we now have the carriers but not enough aircraft. We have aircraft. Please, no one use this video to say the Royal Navy in Britain does not have F-35Bs. We do. We just don't have enough of them. And the reason we don't have enough of them is because of David Cameron's government not making the orders at the right time and other governments subsequently not jumping up. So in the nicest way, that is on David Cameron, that's on Theresa May, that's on Boris Johnson. But you can also say the reason we had the Harrier gap was because we were going to have a carrier gap, because we had older carriers and the new carriers weren't coming in. The reason we were having the carriers delayed was because Gordon Brown and Tony Blair actually chose at various points to pay to slow the construction of the carriers, to the point that we actually paid for 3 carriers pretty much, or 3.5 carriers depending on your sums, and actually only took delivery of 2 because we paid that much in delaying fees. So, (1964). Sorry, what was that about SSBN on alert peer side? Yes, that's one of the Liberal Democrat ideas they put forward last election that they were going to suggest for the defence for the strategic deterrent. That we only have 2 SSBNs and one of them be sitting on alert at peer side to deploy when they needed it. Frank Swanner, did the RN turn into a fleeting being in the Cold War? No, because they did actually accomplish the Falklands War, so they're not a fleeting being. They are a different form of, not a full fleet, but they're a capable fleet. Again, my view is that in a slim chance you get CVA-1 through and built, you ultimately end up with two ships. The third and fourth Hermes and Victory probably wouldn't have been replaced. Wouldn't have materialized, mainly due to pressure of manning those ships would in place in the RN through the 1980s. I think they'd have probably got to 3. I can understand your point, ES, engaging strategy. I can really understand your point on that one. And I do concede it would have been, I doubt they would have got 4, but as I said, 3. It depends though, because if a government is pursuing if governments are pursuing a maritime strategy, if they're pursuing a fudging strategy, then it's 2 to 3. If they are pursuing a maritime strategy for British security, i.e. they're going all in on the GI-UK gap rather than Central Front, then they might well push for the free Invincibles to pretty much strengthen that up. But it's an idea of what could have happened. It is the extreme ends. In the middle is probably 2 to 3 CPO ones. Sean Quigley, hello. To go back to pre-World War II, and supposing in a United Island breakaway Scotland and S&P were both to decide to remain complete neutral, selling to neither side, could England produce enough ships? Yes. It wouldn't be easy, but they could. But in the nicest way, it also depends on when they've gone independent. That's going to sound terrible, but if Scotland and United Ireland go independent in 1939, then that's a problem. If United Ireland and Scotland go independent at the end of World War One, then by 1939 the other yards would have got the orders, because in the nicest way they wouldn't have had the British government ordering ships from them. But it's because that's what happens. You have to remember the British government makes the orders, but most of the ships that Britain is building in the 1920s and 30s, there are a few coming from Scotland, a fair number coming from Scotland and from Harland and Wolff, but a large number also come from Camel Laird's, come from Vickers on Tyne in Newcastle. And Southampton can build them, and there are yards all around the country, and there's yards in Cornwall and Devon. They are all being used to build things. I mean, to be fair, Hercules can operate from grass fields, can't they? They're not really a flat grass field in the Falklands. King George VI. I was referring to a fleeting being as one that keeps the port. My apologies. I should have clarified. Callum, I now have added the British battle tanks to my I want list. Enjoy. Engage zone. E2C on my preferred option. Gamut AEW7. Probably E2C. Mainly because that would again provide another sucker. Let's be honest. Here's the thing. If the British are buying E2C from the Americans, then the Americans become very, very pro the British maintaining its carrier battle force. In which case, the British government is more likely to get them the third carrier, because it makes the Americans happy. Jermic, also, what plane would serve as tanker on CVA-1? Buccaneers or buddy tanks? Probably. Greg says, realistically not a carrier flayed down in 1979. As I said, an enhanced... Well, I think in 1979 I said it's an A, but she could have got an enhanced Invincible class, but a slightly bigger version of them. Or alternatively, she could have got an airborne early warning. James Hadley, if we had Ark Royal CVA-1, the Black Buck raids would likely not be necessary. You could have had a Buccaneer strike package escorted in by Phantoms. Probably. But they might have done the black box raids anyway, just to scare the rest of Argentina. Anuk, was there ever any political party running to rearm the UN? No. How much does each carrier cost? Not as much as the price of the program cost would have you believe. It's kind of like the Daring class destroyers, which are all £1 billion destroyers when you look at the program cost, but when you look at the actual build cost, it's about 480 to 500 million, depending on which one you're looking at. And the fact is that that's because the development and development cost a lot of money, but it was designed to be sort of spread over a 12-ship program, so it would have equated to $750 million per ship, probably actually less, because as you build more, the actual hull units get cheaper. So the hull units of the next 6 would probably have been 400 million each. So instead of it being 6 billion, it would probably be 8.4 billion. And so spread over 6 vessels, that's, work it out, as I say. Spread over 12 vessels, 8.4 is, what, 700 million? Still a lot of money. It's a lot of hospitals. I do admit that. But I'm just saying it gets cheaper as you build more. Seamush, only 2 now. Interesting. Don't you need at least 3 to be effective? Don't remind me, Steve. I'd venture to suggest that the Vincentiano de Mayo would not have even sailed. The Phantom and Buccaneers had proven repulsive reputations. Potentially. What are the next carriers in the UK? The UK is building. We built them. The Queen Elizabeth class. They're in service. Menacing 40. To be honest, would it have even been in service by 82? Just having it being built would have completely changed the Argentine evaluation of Britain doesn't have stomach or will to fight a war, wouldn't it? Potentially. So much hadn't thought about it before, but UK apparently does not consider China a possible enemy. Don't get me started, Steve. Do not get me started. Engaged potentially. Argentina and the UK did have some nasty military capabilities. It was more its belief that there would be no response, which was a political call. They are able to say they believed that the Americans would stop any British response and that therefore they would protect it. In card, John Knott seemed to be prepared to sell anything afloat. John Knott was interesting. Graham Hanna. I agree. The SSNs would make the first interception attempt, but if that failed, for whatever reason, then a carrier strike would at least be a viable fallback option. I think actually the SSNs almost did make an intercept of the Vicente Mio, but it managed to get away. Frank Spanner, is there still a defence treaty between the UK and Singapore? Yes, it's called the Five Powers Act. It includes Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Singapore, and Malaysia. Frank Spanner, did the Azores do anything to help in anything in 82? There were lots of different islands being used at various points in 1982. John Luke, would CVA-1 lead to a significant divergence from current carriers? Also maintaining free CVA-2 would have also maintenance escort and escort numbers. Would US or aircraft soften long-term costs? Potentially. I think if they did go to free CVA-1s. The thing is, if you have the CVA-1s entering service in 1981, let's say the last one, and 1973, 1977, 1981 would be the free you would have in service, you'd probably be talking about 40 to 50 years life expectancy. So we would be 1973, 40 years life expectancy would take us up to 20. Well, let's put it this way: 2013. Now, if we go 50, it's 2023. So honestly, we'd probably be building their replacements about now, rather than the Queen Elizabeth. We'd have been started building a bit later. Very said, lack of proper AEW was definitely a huge error in doctrine. It was. King George V, they're gas powered. Do you think the next generation Royal Navy carriers, whatever they be nuclear powered or remain diesel? They're gas powered. They might become nuclear powered, but it's more likely to be hydrogen after gas. In Carr, no Rosyth, no Scarborough flow would also present strategic difficulties if Scotland was independent. They would present issues, but you'd have to deal with them. And Rosyth is more an issue today than it would have been then. James Hadley, I've read one of the RNSSNs was shanning the carrier and could have made an attack, but it was deemed more political to attack less prestigious unit, the Belgrano. Actually, if you look at the reports and read it, a fair number of books, there are all sorts of different theories, but the reality is it seems that the carrier turned back slightly earlier and was pushing slightly further away, and they didn't have as good a shot. So they decided not to take it. Gahan, can you tell us a little about how Australia helped the UK in 1982? There might have been a very interesting task group sitting in the South Atlantic, which might have had, as I understand it, there's a sort of interesting task group which sort of forms up not too deeper into the further to the African side of the South Atlantic, which might have had some allied nations which may have been prepared to come across, but I've never been really able to prove it more than strong rumours. And when I say rumours, I mean people who I trust to know these things. Implicitly have told me that they happened, but I haven't been able to find any documents about it. Dr. C, I thought you said the RM will use an auxiliary as a temporary carrier. I think they could use as I point out, the LHD program would be an interesting one. And there is more. The more and more we start talking about the future of littoral strike and the future options for it and the replacement vessels to come, the more and more they're sounding like LHDs to replace Albion and Bulwark, which will probably provide us with the backup carrier if it needs to be. Engage James Hadley, the SSN lost contact with the Argentinian carrier before the call to start sinking that things were made. Conqueror had the shot on Belgrano, the other boat didn't. It was HMS Swifter, I think it was, which was after the carrier, if I remember quickly. Dan Frim, I always quite liked the Belgrano. World War II was sunk by a World War II era Mark 8 torpedo. I do not like any of the crew being hurt, let alone killed, but we like the symmetry of it being a World War II thing. Yeah. Anyway, right, it's now 9:30, and I have potentially a long drive tomorrow. So I'm going to answer questions, but I'm also going to say, as at the beginning, if you like the videos, please like, please share, please subscribe, because, as I said at the beginning, I currently have a bet going with my aunt. It's bragging rights, but it's bragging rights with a special thing. If I get the 13,000 subscribers by December 31st, 2021, my aunt will take a picture of her and my uncle wearing Blackburn face masks. So, please, Help a naval historian out. Carl, I will answer that. Well, you'll work out that when I'm doing if I'm doing lives from where I'm going, but I'm possibly going on a research trip down to the southwest. It's all touch and go getting down there and sorting things out. Frank Sparrow, what nations or colonies did the Allies invade to keep out of control Axis forces? Lots of them. Britain invaded Iceland, for starters, and I think Greenland as well. We also invaded Madagascar. It basically go down a list of French colonies in Africa or around Southeast Asia, and if the Axis didn't get them first, the British were there. Thank you, John Shea. Take care. Thank you, King George VI. And lots of them. Anything around South Wales next week, early on? No. I'm sorry, a long way from South Wales. Take care, Seneca. Shave off the few feathers you have on your forehead. In the nicest way, I have a lot of them. Frank Smart, do you agree with the Allies having to invade them? It made sense at the time. I'm not sure whether it was possibly the best idea, but it was definitely... Let's be honest, they invade Madagascar because they're worried that the Japanese are going to come take Madagascar, and that's going to make them part of the Battle Atlantic. So, frankly, Madagascar makes a lot of sense. The rest... How much use are they to Axis forces? How much use are they to anyone else? Thanks, Bishram. Thank you, Aaron. Take care. Have fun. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and take care. Have a nice evening. Thank you, Dan Freeman. Thank you, Steve Windish. Thank you, Abuzaski. Thank you, Franz Bernardo. Thank you, Andrew Campbell. Thank you, Bishram. Thank you, Greg Salsky. Thank you, DGB40. Thank you, Dan Freeman. Thank you, Jess P. King George VI. Thank you, Melanie1640. Thank you, Engaging Strategy. Hope you enjoyed it. Engaging Strategy, there's a link down below to the pre-recorded video as well, which if you haven't seen, you might enjoy it. And thank you, Colin Gosman. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Take care. Sorry, Melanie. Just winding up. Take care, everyone. Thank you, Frank Sparado. Thank you.